He lost everything in this world. His parents, his purpose, his will to live. But then he was gifted magic, and a second chance in another world. With space magic in his hands, he now moves freely between city and village, searching for the life they always wanted him to have. He's building the perfect life. Can peace be found when you stop running? Let's find out. This world is not so bad. The story of Futai Kureto began with the loss of his father. 4 days ago, his father passed away. His mother died of illness when he was still a child, and he doesn't even call his remaining relatives. He doesn't have a girlfriend either, nor any close friends. In fact, there was nothing that would hold him in this world. However, he couldn't even imagine that everything would turn out like this. 10 minutes ago, the protagonist was walking down the street with bags in his hands and saying, "Finally, everything is over." At that moment, he thought, it's hard to grieve alone. I wonder if it was hard for his father at his mother's funeral too? Cars were honking around him. He walked along without paying attention to it. The protagonist said, so in the end, he was alone. Leading a lonely life, a 27-year-old bachelor from Harioji. He has no close relatives, friends, or a lover. He has been so busy these past few days that he began to move without thinking. At that moment, he felt as if his father was calling him. Kureto, he had returned. Out of habit, he headed to his parents' house. He thought his father would be there. Later, he stood on the bridge, put his head on the railing, held it with his hands, and asked, would he never greet him again? Today was the end of his paid vacation. No, he had asked for another half-day off. Then his phone rang in his pocket. He took out his phone and read the message. Because he had taken a day off, all work had stopped. He couldn't do anything. Let him not go to the funeral when they were busy. He had to go to work tomorrow. No more days off this year. Otherwise, he would cut his salary. The protagonist thought he was kidding. Then he said he didn't care that he had lost the last member of his family. He was so sick of all this. He looked down from the bridge and thought, it seems like he really doesn't belong here. He wants to go somewhere where he can live comfortably. He said, maybe he should give up everything and go far, far away? At that time, he heard an unfamiliar voice in his head that said, it will help him with this. Kureto turned around and asked in surprise, whose voice was that? Then he found himself next to a magical symbol that began to suck him in, and then he found himself in another place. He stood on the street and looked around in surprise and asked, what is this? The unfamiliar voice said, another world, a distant place that he wanted to go to so much. The protagonist asked again in surprise, another world? The familiar voice continued, it gave him the power to go to distant places. Let him live here as he wishes. Kureto turned around and shouted for him to wait, and that's all the explanation? What does all this mean? And in response, silence. Then he looked around and saw people looking at him in surprise, and he thought, no way. He really did say he wanted to go somewhere, but he never thought he'd end up in another world. Then he thought about it, however, he didn't want to work in that black company anymore anyway. He walked forward and thought that he needed to move. That way he could come to his senses faster. The fear wouldn't go away as long as he just stood there. Now he was completely confused. He didn't know how to get back home, but there was nothing he could do about it. Honestly, he didn't want to go back. Now he needed to think about how to make it so that he could live here. He looked at the people and said, apparently, this world was like a game, something in the fantasy genre. He had read something like that. In any case, whatever this world was, he needed money. Then he put his hand to his chin and thought, but how could he earn it? The protagonist walked and wondered, why were they looking like that? He began to examine himself and assumed that it was probably because of his clothes. They stood out quite a lot. It was unlikely that there was anything of the same color and shape here. He needed to sell it and buy a new one with the money. At that time, he saw a sign in front of him and thought, here's a clothing store. He went inside and a salesman immediately ran up to him, shouted, welcome, His Honor. What clothes is he looking for today? The protagonist thought in surprise, took him for a nobleman, and said that he wanted to sell these clothes and buy others. The salesman looked at him and said, they look pretty good, quality work. Is he sure? I see, the clothes of the locals do not look very good, so they took him for an aristocrat. It is better to remain silent, there is less chance of being deceived. He agreed and said, of course, then asked how much it would cost. The salesman said, the fabric is good and no damage, 40 gold coins. The protagonist raised his hand to his chin and thought, by the way, he does not know anything about the monetary system of this world. The shopkeeper continued, oh, then let's make it 45. The protagonist looked at him and said he doesn't even know. Meanwhile, the shopkeeper raised his hand and shouted, 50 gold coins. He assures that no other store will offer more. The MC crossed his arms and thought, he hoped so, then replied, okay, we have a deal. The shopkeeper thanked him. The protagonist asked him if he could help him pick out some normal clothes that are customary to wear in this city. The shopkeeper went to look at the things, turned around and said, sure sir, right away. After a while, he came out of the shop, dressed and said, He bought the minimum equipment, 5 silver and 5 copper coins spent. Then he thought, by the way, only now he noticed that he was speaking a different language, and he can read without problems. Was that creature at work again? He spoke as if there was nothing to worry about, but just in case, it was worth checking everything later. Suddenly, he heard a voice that apologized to him. He looked up in surprise and saw a girl in front of him who asked if he wanted to buy flowers. He asked again, flowers? The protagonist thought, this is a good opportunity. Then he leaned towards her and said, okay, he will buy them. She was happy and said, really? At that moment, he had an idea, he continued, but instead he would like to ask her something, okay? She shouted, okay, but first buy flowers. She will then answer any question you have. The protagonist thought, surprisingly stubborn child. He understood everything and asked how much one cost. She raised her hand and shouted 2 bronze coins. The protagonist held the coins to her in his hand and said, here, for her to hold. She thanked him. He continued, so what? Will she answer his question? She added that she would. The protagonist thought, a bit of a strange way, but at least it was cheap. Then he picked up the coin in his hand, looked at it and asked, so? Could she explain the value of this money to him? At that moment, he thought that he couldn't ask an adult about it. They would immediately think that he was some kind of weird guy. She asked in surprise, is that all? He agreed and said that her story would help him a lot. The protagonist thought, for him, this is a matter of life and death. The girl took a stick and wrote on the ground, then shouted that it's done. He looked at the ground and thought, so this is how it works. Platinum coin, 100,000 yen. Gold coin, 10,000 yen. Silver coin, 1,000 yen. Copper coin, 100 yen. Bronze coin, 10 yen. It turns out that if you count in Japanese money, he now has 494,460 yen. The protagonist closed his eyes, looked up and thought, he is not rich, but it is enough to start a new life. At this time, the girl shook his sleeve and asked if he wanted to ask anything else. Kureto asked what the name of this city and country was. She replied, they were in Zerala, the capital of the Ardeos kingdom. He thought he didn't know such names, as expected, then asked if she had ever heard of a country called Japan. She asked again, what? The first time she heard of it. He looked at her and thought, this really is another world, and added, he was also looking for a place to find a job. She looked at him and asked, uncle, is he unemployed? He smiled, agreed, and said, he's a traveler. He arrived here just recently. Then he thought, he is 27, but they already call him uncle. She replied, if he needs a job, let him go to the Adventurers Guild. He asked, a guild? Is it a place where they give quests and then pay for them? Just like in the game. The girl agreed, raised her hands up and shouted, a man can get rich. MC replied, okay, and asked, will she show him where this place is then? The girl replied, okay. Meanwhile, they reached the Adventurers Guild house. The protagonist opened the door, saw people and thought, tough guys. I need to act natural, as if I were passing by bandits at a convenience store. Someone asked, is this a new guy? Then the receptionist waved her hand and loudly said, welcome, the Adventurers Guild is at your service. He went to the counter and thought, beast man, are those ears fake? She asked, does he have some business? Kureto stood there, looking at her and thought, it's impolite to stare at her for so long. He replied that he would like to become an adventurer. She continued, okay, then go through the registration. Then she asked, does he need to explain how the guild works? He agreed and said that he needed to just in case. She replied, okay, all adventurers have ranks from SA to F. The rank can be increased depending on the rate of completed quests. The higher the rank, the higher the reward, and the more difficult the quests. There are only a few S-rank adventurers in their country. They are quite influential people who often take quests directly from the royal family, so many strive to get the highest rank. At the time of registration, each adventurer receives rank F. You can start with safe work, such as finding missing items, delivering or cleaning the city. As the rank increases, subduing monsters, collecting valuable materials, escorting and so on become available. In this way, you can gradually receive more and more difficult quests. And then she added, by the way, if he works in a group and the management approves it, he can take a quest of a higher rank. She clenched her fists and asked him to try to achieve as high a rank as possible. He agreed. The administrator continued, well, and of course, things like violence, theft, and murder are prohibited, that's it. The protagonist thought the minimum information. She added, that's all she had to tell him. If he didn't change his mind, the registration procedure would require an entry fee of 5 silver coins. He thought he'd have to ask questions along the way. Then he agreed and said, sure. Meanwhile, she put a crystal in front of him, pointed at it with her hand and said, well, then she asked him to hold his hand over this crystal. He asked, what is this? The administrator explained, it's for registering information about adventurers. Such balls are in all guilds, they are not used to exchange data. He brought his hand to his mouth, thoughtfully said, very convenient, but how do they work? The girl apologized and said that she couldn't tell him that. He also apologized in response for asking such strange questions. She did not agree and continued, she just doesn't understand it herself. Then she told him to put his hand on it. The protagonist did so, and the crystal lit up. The girl shouted, "Oh, information appeared." She started reading, Futai Kureto, then asked, "What is this?" Then she continued reading, Futai Kureto, a human of rank F, skill, space magic, and asked, "Space magic?" Then she turned and said in surprise, "Mrs. Lumina, she has a newbie with a space magic skill here. Has she heard anything about it?" She asked, "What is she talking about? Does she mean that it is not fire, water, earth, wind, darkness, or light?" The girl answered, "That is true. This is her first time encountering such magic. Shouldn't they inform the guild master about this?" She answered, "The guild master is on a business trip." The protagonist apologized and asked if they could continue with the registration. The girl raised her hand and asked, what should she do? Lumina added questioningly, "Is it really that serious?" He did nothing wrong. There is no rule that an adventurer with non-standard magical abilities cannot be registered. The girl agreed and said, "That's right." Then the receptionist picked up the token, handed it to the protagonist and said, "So this token confirms that he is an F-rank adventurer. He will be exempt from paying the fee when completing quests. Please note that if he loses it, he will be fined 3 silver coins." He replied that he understood, then turned around and headed for the exit. She shouted back at him, "Registration is complete. Would you like to receive your first quest?" The protagonist turned around and disagreed, then added he would come back for it when he was ready. The protagonist went outside, saw some barrels and decided to try magic. Then he stretched out his hand and said, "Cut." After that, the barrel fell in half, as if someone had cut it. Then he once again extended his hand forward, said, "Distortion," and a funnel appeared in the barrel, and then a hole. He said, "A skill that affects space itself." Amazingly, earlier, when he touched the crystal, he received knowledge about the magic of this world. There really is no magic here that would affect space. In theory, it should not exist at all, because it is capable of destroying anything. The protagonist came closer and said, "The one who uses magic can become dangerous." Probably this power appeared thanks to that mysterious creature that transferred him here. The protagonist looked at the barrel and said questioningly, "To give such magic and throw it into this world, what is it thinking about?" He thought he was not given some important mission, as it happens in games or manga. By the way, he gave him the power to go to distant lands. The power to go? I wonder if it is possible to move in space with its help? Here he stopped, closed his eyes and thought that he should imagine a roof. Suddenly he was on the roof, looked down and said, "Instantly teleported." Then he looked further, saw a tall building and said, "Go there, where there is a more beautiful view." At the same moment, he jumped on the balcony and looked down, said, "It was scary, but it was worth it. What a beautiful view." The protagonist looked into the distance and said, "Dad." The protagonist turned and imagined his father. He called him and told him not to think only about work. His life belongs only to him, to live the life he wants to live. He closed his eyes and imagined, no skyscrapers, no cars, no trains, no company he hates, no superficial awkward relationships. Just like that mysterious voice said, "You can go far away and live the way you want. This is the best thing you can do." The protagonist proudly said, he wants to live the way he wants. He really does. Then he leaned against the railing, closed his eyes and said, his father and that mysterious voice, they are right. He will use this magic and try to live a happy life. In any case, with this power, he can go anywhere. The possibilities are endless. Kurito, this is a good way to find your place. The next day, this is his first job. The protagonist came to the guild and said loudly, "Great, well, it's time to start working." Then he looked and thought, although this is a simple delivery, at first he wanted to take it in quantity, but the girl screamed, 5 quests at once? This is impossible. If he does not have time, then he will be fined. MC answered, but he is sure that he can handle it. She added that she cannot approve of this, he must reduce it to at least 2. He said, but she does not know what his magic is capable of. Nothing can be done. With rank F, he can only take on small jobs. MC brought his hand to his face and thought, in this world, they move around with the help of horses. Courier work goes well with spatial magic, and frankly, he is not interested in exterminating monsters. He thought, no matter how strong this magic is, until yesterday he was an ordinary office plankton. Then he looked at the request form and said, the client's house is in the South District. The destination is the East District. The protagonist said, okay, for starters. Then he jumped up and immediately found himself on the balcony of a high-rise building and said, done. After that, he looked into the distance and added, there is an excellent view from here. The disadvantage of teleportation is that you can only move to the place that you have seen, visited, so you have to climb higher to see where to move. But once you find yourself in a new place, he can teleport there at any time. He looked at the application and into the distance, then said, here it is, the very house. MC pushed off from the balcony, and a second later he was already knocking on the door. The protagonist said hello and said, "He is an adventurer." There was a creak behind the door, and at that very moment a man came out. The main character looked at him and thought, "Is this Mr. Brahm?" He continued that he came to fulfill a delivery request. Mr. Brahm was surprised and said, "Wow, they work fast," and added, "The chairs are over there in the garden," asked him to give this to his granddaughter. He turned, agreed, said he was going, and headed towards the chairs. Mr. Brahm waved and wished him a good journey. Kureto looked at the chairs and said, "Well," then he stretched out his hand and said, "Spatial storage." A tunnel opened in front of him. He put the chairs in there and shouted, "Come on. This magic is too convenient, seriously." He thought, just like the inventory in computer games. Still can't believe it. Time stops inside. The protagonist moved and said, "Well, he'll think about it later." After a while, he knocked on the door and said, "Hello, this is a delivery." The floorboards creaked. Kureto held the request form in his hands and said he brought her 2 chairs as requested by Mr. Brahm. She raised her hands to her chest and screamed, "These are the chairs that Grandpa talked about. They are heavy, so she didn't expect them to be brought so soon." "Mr. Adventurers are really strong." He laughed in response. She closed her eyes, smiled, said she was glad they came so quickly, and thanked him. The protagonist thought he was so used to the work routine that he took everything for granted. He needs to get moving. "Thanks for the work. When was the last time?" The protagonist replied, "Please." Then he held the door handle and said goodbye to her. A few days later, he was in the guild. There were a lot of people, and it was very noisy. The receptionist called him loudly and asked him to come to her. He came over, wanted to say something, but he couldn't remember her name. She asked in surprise, "What? Did he really forget her name?" She smiled and introduced herself. "Her name is Kushi." In charge of Mr. Kureto's work, and asked him not to forget. He thought she was acting like she was the boss here. Since she didn't believe that he had completed the entire task so quickly, he had to show how spatial magic works. Such magic originally didn't exist in this world, but after weighing all the pros and cons, he decided that it would be easier to work this way. Kushi screamed in surprise. "Impossible. Only 15 minutes had passed. She can't believe it." Then he answered with displeasure, "Okay, I'll have to prove it." He told her everything, and she was very surprised by this information. He looked at her and thought, "Still hasn't come to her senses?" Then she came to her senses and muttered that. MC said, however, "Everything is so strict here." She asked, "So what did he want?" Then she raised her hand up and continued, "The thing is, Mr. Kureto, would he like to go outside the royal capital?" He was surprised and asked again, "Outside the capital? Why all of a sudden?" Kushi continued, "Well, Mr. Kureto, he's working like crazy. At this rate, the other adventurers will have no work left. F-rank adventurers will soon have nothing to eat." He apologized. She offered, but if he works outside the capital, he can fulfill as many requests as he wants. He crossed his arms over his chest, thought about it, and said, "Outside the capital then." The protagonist thought about it, but he was also interested in it. Outside the royal capital, there are monsters that attack people. He closed his eyes and continued to think. His magic is certainly strong, but it's still a little scary. She said if he agreed, then she brought her hand to her mouth, grinned ominously, and noted that in addition to increasing the fee, she would recommend a promotion to E rank. The higher the rank, the higher the salary. He agreed, said that he could not resist the words of promotion and salary increase, just like balm for the soul. She smiled and thanked him. Outside the capital. After some time, Kureto stood near the wall, raised his hand to his forehead and said, "There is nothing behind the wall. The road goes beyond the horizon." With a token and a request form, he was able to leave the city for free. After all, being an adventurer is quite useful. Although it was possible to simply move through the wall. The protagonist took the application form in his hands, looked, read, instead of delivery, the village of Howin. The package was money and a letter. The letter was a trifle, but the money was a serious responsibility. He thought these were more complex tasks that required time and physical strength, something like a test to increase rank. Suddenly a strong wind arose. He thoughtfully said, "Howin village." Then he looked into the distance, lowered his arms, stretched out and said, "What a beautiful view." He had not seen anything like this in the previous world. Then he concentrated and said that he had to go. MC said, "Teleport," and ran along the road at high speed. He was surprised and said, "Much faster than riding in a carriage." Then he took the request form, looked at it and said, "Howin village is too far away. It will take a lot of time." Then he looked up, saw a bird flying by and thought, the higher he is, the further the view, maybe move to the height of a bird's flight? Bird's serenity. He closed his eyes, thought, nothing to try and said, "Radiance." At that moment he found himself running next to the bird and screamed. It worked. But he's falling down. Bird protest. MC thought, next point. He started to move with big jumps, and he thought it was working. When the protagonist jumped again, he screamed. It was as if he was flying. He knows for sure, the impossible is possible. Then he looked down, saw someone there and asked, "Are they goblins?" They are one of the main targets in the guild. The protagonist thought, but he sees them in real life for the first time. Then he said, Kushi said that there are almost no monsters on this road. Is he a loser or did she lie? The protagonist remembered, by the way, he used such magic only on barrels. Falling to the ground, he thought, of course, there is no particular desire, but who knows what awaits him in the future. MC said, it's decided, and landed on the ground next to it. The goblins looked at him menacingly, their mouths open, showing their teeth. He thought, this'll be practice, then ran at one of the goblins, stretching his arms forward, and shouted, cut. At that moment, the goblin was torn in half, and the halves fell to the ground. The other goblins prepared to attack, headed towards the protagonist. He put his hand forward and shouted, distortion. The goblins were spun and carried away. The protagonist sighed and said, he did it. Then he examined the corpse and said, the more he looks at it, the worse it gets. He had never killed an animal before, so he feels a little guilty. In his mind, he understands that there is nothing wrong with this. But he raised his hands in front of himself and continued, since this is strong magic, it is worth being sure that the one standing in front of him is really an enemy. And if the protagonist thought so, a cockroach, yes, it is better to imagine that there is an insect in front of him. The protagonist said he will cut off the ears as proof of destroying the monsters. At this time, the entrance to the spatial storage opened. After a while, he saw a village below and said, here it is, the village of Howin. After MC came closer and saw a guard near the gate who asked, a traveler? The protagonist was holding a bag in his hands and thought, he looks friendly. He did not agree and added, an adventurer came from the royal capital to complete a quest. He asked, from the royal capital to this village? Unusual. What quest? The protagonist answered, delivering a letter and money. The guard asked who the sender was. He answered, Mr. Greg and Taylor. The guard smiled and shouted, I see. They haven't returned home since they became adventurers. He knows them, Mr. Kurito. They often send money to this wilderness. The protagonist answered, I see, and thought, a cheerful man. Then he asked, well then, could he take it to the addressee? The guard said, oh, come on. No one is rushing him. It's almost sunset. He'll give it back tomorrow. The protagonist thought, maybe it's really impolite to disturb people during dinner. In principle, it doesn't matter to him. He can move here in the morning. MC answered, I see, and thought that he saw this place, so there are no problems. He was about to leave, turned around and said that they will see each other tomorrow. The guard asked where he was going. There is nowhere to stay there. Then he smiled and said, okay, he can spend the night at his place. The protagonist looked at him in surprise and asked, what? He thought, no, he is not. At this time, the guard hugged him by the neck, dragged him, and loudly said that he will tell about the royal capital. The protagonist tried to object. A little later, they approached the guard's house. He raised his hand up and shouted for his family to meet them. A woman came out to them and said, welcome back. Then she looked at the protagonist and asked, who is this guy? The protagonist apologized for bothering them and introduced himself as Kurito, an adventurer. She said how polite he was and introduced herself as Stella, Andre's wife. The protagonist looked at him and asked, is that his name? He was surprised and said, didn't he introduce himself? Then he smiled and continued, oh well, who cares? Stella put her hand to her forehead and said, oh my god, this fool is always like that. The protagonist thanked them for letting him spend the night. Andre yelled at his wife to make dinner for Kurito too. She said, okay, and told the protagonist to make himself at home. He apologized again, went into the house, looked around, and thought, this was the first time he stayed in an ordinary house in this world. Before that he stayed in a hotel, and it seems that here they don't take off their shoes. The protagonist walked on, then turned around when he heard a voice. At this time, a girl was coming down the stairs and shouted, welcome back, Dad. Do we have a new customer? Andre introduced, this is his daughter Nina, then added, Nina, this is Kurito. The protagonist leaned over to the girl and said, nice to meet you. He is Kurito, an adventurer. Her kind father allowed him to stay with them for the night. She smiled and shouted, she is Nina. She is very pleased to meet you. The protagonist thought, it seems that she is not a difficult child, but a sweet girl. At this moment, Andre grabbed him and threatened him not to dare lay a finger on his lovely daughter. Kurito asked if maybe he would let him go, then added that he had no intention of doing so. Then Stella grabbed her husband by the scruff of the neck and said, stop talking nonsense, it would be better if he helped her. Andre got angry and shouted that he understood. The protagonist thought, she's strong. Andre turned to his daughter and said, by the way, Nina, Kurito came from the royal capital. The girl clenched her fists and squealed, the royal capital? Nina jumped up and down and screamed, he really lives in the capital? Amazing. He must have a lot of stories. He said, well, sort of. At that moment, Stella asked if everything was okay and added that in their village, they always listened with interest to the stories of travelers. She asked if he didn't mind, please, let him talk to her daughter. He said, okay. And he thought in surprise, people here are also drawn to big cities. At that time, Andre passed by, pointed at him and shouted at him not to do anything strange. He's watching him. The protagonist thought he was an idiot. After a while, Stella cooked dinner and they sat down at the table. The girl looked at it with big eyes. Wow. The protagonist was drooling. He tried the food and thought, wow, it really is delicious. Andre was holding a bottle of wine in his hands and asked, would he like some wine? The protagonist replied, but as long as it is not too strong. Andre continued to tell him not to worry and drink. Then he poured some wine into a glass and handed it to the protagonist. He sniffed it and said, the smell is good, not sour at all. He asked, do you understand? The winemakers here are quite picky, and that is why their wine is good. Then they clinked their glasses. Kanpai, it's time to eat. He took a sip and said, rich, full-bodied taste. Andre replied in a satisfied voice, he did say it. Nina called out to him and said loudly, the salad is also very tasty. The vegetables are straight from the garden. Stella added that he should not be shy, there is enough for everyone. He thanked her, then turned to Nina and said, delicious. The food Stella cooked was amazing. She thanked him. That's right, what Stella cooked was the best food in the world. She told him not to suck up. The protagonist remembered that his mother died early, so all this was new to him, but he liked this kind of atmosphere. Andre looked at him and asked what happened. He replied, he just thought how great it was to have his own farm. Andre asked, so why shouldn't he try it himself? He added that MC should stop adventuring and move to this village. He will teach him the art of hunting. The protagonist asked in surprise, really? It's a nice quiet life here. Tomorrow he will continue his work in the village. The first morning in the village. The protagonist slept on the bed and talked in his sleep, to hell with their company. Then he felt someone stirring next to him, and added, now, just a little more. At this time, he received a kick in the face and woke up. Nina was sleeping there, her arms and legs stretched out. He stood up, left the room and started walking down the stairs. Stella saw him there and said good morning. She was standing with a laundry basket and asked, well, did he get enough sleep? He agreed and then thanked her for the pajamas. She apologized for the pajamas being so stretched out and asked, had Nina woken up yet? He said that she hadn't woken up, and she was sleeping so soundly that he didn't wake her up. Stella continued, there were no children her age in the village, and all the young people were leaving for the capital. It seemed like they were having fun. She hoped he hadn't done something like that. The protagonist shouted, weren't they bored? By the way, were there any problems with Andre? He felt a little uneasy. He remembered yesterday. Nina approached the protagonist and said that she would sleep with Coretto to hear more about the royal capital. Andre looked at them and shouted, are they joking? Then he added that he should listen in case anything happened. Then Stella said no. She managed to convince him that everything would be fine. Suddenly the protagonist heard Andre's voice behind him, asking who was worrying too much here. Then he added that he had an only daughter. It was natural that he was worried. MC said good morning, Mr. Andre. He replied morning. Then he asked so he didn't do anything strange? The protagonist irritably shouted that he didn't do anything. Stella chuckled. Why was he asking? He already went out every half hour to look and immediately said that they should go wash up. Breakfast was ready. They agreed. The protagonist looked at the table where breakfast was and thought, it looks delicious. I need to wash up quickly. They had breakfast and hit the road. The protagonist looked into the distance, thought, it's so quiet and calm here, a peaceful atmosphere. He walked behind Andre and said, a nice village, it feels like time has stopped here. He closed his eyes and said, young people find it boring. Then he turned to the protagonist and began to reason. Boredom is a kind of luxury. Maybe it depends on your point of view, but he likes this phrase. No wonder he despaired in his home world. There he never felt like he was here for a minute. He closed his eyes, crossed his arms over his chest and thought, people think that this is boredom, not realizing that they can just afford it. But if you think about it, a lot of time has passed since he ended up in this world, but only today he slept so soundly. A little earlier, they were sitting on the bed and Nina asked if there really were many different races living in the capital. The main character replied that this was also something new for him. She asked if maybe he would like to tell her something else. He answered he didn't even know what else to talk about. She asked in surprise, really? He answered that he had only recently arrived in the capital. She continued the conversation and asked, where was he from? He said, well, it's a pretty remote place. She looked at him and asked, is his homeland very far? It must be hard for him. The protagonist agreed and added, it's only for the best for him. Nina closed her eyes, smiled and screamed, so from now on, he'll have a lot of fun things every day. He looked at her in surprise and said, yeah. A little later, MC said that's right. They arrived. There was a residential building in front of them. Andre said, this is Greg and Taylor's house. The protagonist asked in surprise, are they neighbors? He laughed, agreed and added, what a sweet couple. Then he turned to Coretto and asked, will he call his relatives then? The protagonist agreed. Later, a man came out to them, who introduced himself as Greg's father. and a woman who said she was Taylor's mother. The protagonist said good morning and introduced himself. He was Kureto, an adventurer, and he had a package for them. Then he handed them a bag of money. The man was very surprised and took the bag. The protagonist didn't understand and asked if something was wrong. The man looked inside and asked, "Is this the money?" The protagonist agreed and said that everything was correct. The woman said in surprise, "Usually only letters came?" He asked, "Maybe this is what the letter said?" The man said, "Let's see now," and started reading the letter. The protagonist thought, despite the fact that he is F rank, the guild trusts him, then asked, "Is there something about him?" They agreed and added, "He was recommended by the guild, so they decided to send money. It seems like this is a test." MC got angry and shouted, "Really? Is the whole amount there? Check it." The man agreed and said that the amount matches what is written in the letter. The protagonist closed his eyes and thought, "Cunning Kushi, after all, this was a test." They thanked him for coming all this way, and the man added, "If he meets their stupid sons, let him say hello to them." He said, "Of course." Later they were walking down the road. Andre turned around and asked, "Is the quest complete?" The protagonist confirmed and thanked him for his help. He asked, "So will he leave right now?" The protagonist agreed and said the job is done. Andre said, "I see, that's the fate of an adventurer, but first he has to say goodbye to Stella and Nina." He replied, "Okay, he owes them." After a while the protagonist went in to say goodbye. Nina heard and asked, "What? Is he leaving already?" He raised his hands up and replied, "He would stay a little longer, but he really can't." She sadly replied, "I see," then extended her hand to him and asked, "Will he visit them next time then?" The MC said, "Yeah," extended his hand back to her and added that he would definitely visit. Then he heard Andre's voice behind him, who said, "Don't even think about hitting on his Nina. No one will defile his little blood." The protagonist turned around and said that he didn't mean to. "Does he even realize what the age difference is?" Andre asked, "Is he 18 already?" "Basically, he is." The protagonist replied that they gave him too little and thought, "Does he really look that young?" Then he added, "Actually, he is 27 years old." Stella looked at him in surprise and shouted, "No way." Andre shouted, "He's a year younger than him?" MC was indignant. 28? Why the hell was he addressing him like an adult? He thought he was an old man. Andre responded, "How rude." The protagonist crossed his arms over his stomach and thought, however, this clearly does not concern Andre. And yes, the Japanese often look younger than their age. At this time, Stella was holding a bag in her hands, called him and said if he liked her cooking, then he can take it with him. He turned around and said in surprise, "Seriously?" She agreed and said that there was some left over from yesterday. He thought, great, there will be something to eat, and thanked her, then said, "Well, thanks again for their support," and went on his way. Andre shouted that next time he can stay with them. Nina waved her hands and shouted that they will see each other. He left and thought, so kind to a stranger adventurer, it seems like they are really good people. Spending time with them made him feel at ease, as if he had become part of the family. If he can afford to live like this, then perhaps he will come here again. Okay. He raised one hand up and pulled himself up, then thought, it's time to go back to the guild. He felt like he found a place where he would be told again, welcome back. The day after he parted ways with this kind family and left Hourin village, he was successfully promoted to E rank. There were two benefits to rank promotion. The first was that the type and number of requests available to him increased, allowing him to complete more quests and save time. The second was even simpler. The quests he completed were paid more money. Thus, he began to earn more than any other adventurer. After some time, some bandit adventurers approached him. Luke said that he did not know what tricks he was using to complete so many requests, but if he was an adventurer, he should earn money from combat quests. However, the protagonist felt that this would be bad for his reputation. He looked at them in confusion and asked, "What? Are there any rules that require him to accept requests to destroy monsters?" Luke shouted, "What the hell does it matter? They are pissed off that hyenas like him are leaning around." The protagonist thought, what should he do now? There's no point in talking to people like that. Right. Population, conflicts in the guild are forbidden. He realized that he needed to return to the building. When he wanted to turn around, Nick stood in front of him and, flexing his fists, said, "Where is he going?" They weren't done yet. The people present began to pay attention to them and asked, "What's going on there? A fight?" Then they started shouting, "Great," so that they could fight. One of them said that he would bet 5 coppers on the jock, and the other shouted that he would bet 3. The protagonist thought, damn, enough. What kind of hackneyed cliches are these? Although quarrels often surface here, he had seen similar ones when doing quests. Should he move straight to the guild or just run away? No, that wouldn't solve the problem. It was obvious that he couldn't win in a regular fight, and the cut and distortion couldn't be used on people. Then it dawned on him. I have an idea. If he moves with his opponents with the current number of viewers, it will serve as good advertising. Here it is, an opportunity to move to a new level of making money. Luke looked at him and asked what he was mumbling there. He replied that if the demonstration was successful, it was none of his business. He would work as he saw fit and was not going to adjust to them. If they didn't like it, then let them try to convince him otherwise. The adventurer shouted, "Yeah, that's what they'll do." Then they swung and shouted. If that's the case, then the three of them would beat him up. Then he lifted them into the air with the help of magic, smiled and asked, "Well, are they going to continue the conversation?" The adventurers looked down in fear from above, and suddenly MC said that they were falling. Michael turned to the protagonist and shouted, "He sees. Why the hell is he so calm?" Nick shouted, "What's going on? Head, hold on." The adventurer looked at the protagonist and shouted, "Did he do this?" He agreed and added that if they fell from such a height, they would turn into a pancake. Michael shouted, "Is he going to kill them?" Luke shouted, "Don't." Meanwhile, Michael folded his arms and pitifully asked him to spare them, apologized and added that they were wrong. Luke nervously shouted, "Mom." The protagonist looked at them and thought that they were completely wilted. Had he overdone it? Well, okay. With the help of his magic, they immediately appeared on the ground. Someone asked, "What was that?" They suddenly returned back. He did not know that such magic existed. At this time, the protagonist stood in front of the people, raised his hands up and said loudly, as they all saw, his magic allows one to instantly move great distances. Someone asked again, "Instantly?" Another added, the first time he heard about this, and why was he telling them this? The protagonist answered, he has a suggestion. How about making their movement easier? If it's within his range, he can deliver them to their destination instantly. MC thought, this is his new way of making money, charging money to move adventurers to their mission location. It's a very tempting offer to move from place to place quickly. After all, there's no developed transportation in this world. He can earn more by directly negotiating the delivery fee. He looked at them and reasoned, besides, this is a mutually beneficial offer, but this is the first time they encounter something like this, so he is confused. Is this really a failure? Suddenly, the girl asked, just out of curiosity, what is the benefit in this for him and for them? He perked up, interested, and explained, they will save time and effort, and he will be able to make money just by moving them. She asked how much? He answered, it depends on the distance. From the first customers, he will take 2 silver coins for moving the group one way. She raised her hand to her chin and thoughtfully asked again, 2 silver coins? Someone said, too expensive. He thought, sure, it would be cheaper in a carriage. They charge about 2 coppers per person. No wonder they think it's too expensive. Then one young man stepped forward and said, well then, they, the Thunder Sword, would like to know more about it. Then he adjusted his glasses and asked, is he okay with it? The protagonist replied, no, he was all for it. The girl turned around and screamed, Reed, what the hell, is he serious? Why would they do that? He replied, well, he was still skeptical, but if it was true, then this man's abilities would allow them to make a big step forward. She asked, what made him think that? He suggested they step back and added, no one negotiates in the middle of a crowd. After they stepped back and the protagonist introduced himself, well, his name is Coretto. One of them said, he is Rox, the leader of the Thunder Sword. The girl looked at him with an angry look and introduced herself. Her name was Elena, and if he tried to cheat, she would kill him. The other girl said that her name was Arna. Reed finished the introduction. Smiling, he said that now they could get down to business. Elena shouted, is he crazy? And why do they need these jumps? He answered that it was simple. If Mr. Coretto sends them to the destination, then they will be able to complete many tasks with minimal expenses. She shouted, with minimal expenses? Rock shouted, 2 silver coins is the minimum expense? Reed adjusted his glasses and said, oh well. First of all, they usually ride on horseback or ride in a carriage. If you count all the expenses, it comes to 2 silver coins. When something doesn't work out, even more money is spent. Rox asked in surprise, really? Reed was indignant. Have they ever wondered how much money they spend? The protagonist thought he was condoling with them. And then Reed raised his index finger and continued, if you think about it, then instant movement for 2 silver coins will save them time and effort. They can do several high-paying quests a day. The more quests, the more profit. Plus, I don't have to worry about monsters attacking on the way. The workload is greatly reduced. Rox said happily, I understand. Then Elena hugged the protagonist around the neck, and smiling, apologized for being so mean. They will be friends. He thought irritably. She changed her tune quickly. Then Reed adjusted his glasses again and suggested that they earn more money before the other adventurers get wind of it. If everything goes well, then A rank is not far away. Rox shouted, now he understands. And then the rest of the guild raised their fists and shouted happily, their goal is A rank. Then they suggested to get to work quickly. At that moment, Emilio came around the corner and said, I see, magic that can be used to move? How interesting. After a while, MC was sitting at a table outside and drinking tea. He said that it was time to pick them up. He hoped that the Thunder Sword was doing well. A few hours ago, Rox, looking around in surprise, said, wow, they actually moved here in a second. Elena was surprised. It can't be. Reed adjusted his glasses and said, the carriage ride would have taken 3 days. The protagonist said that he had been to the Cald's plane for work. As he said earlier, his magic can only move them to places he has been to, and the further the place, the more expensive the transfer. He replied that he did not mind. In any case, it was much faster. Now he was convinced that it was worth it. Here is the fee. With these words, he put 2 silver coins in the protagonist's hands. In response, he thanked him and thought, not bad earnings for the simple job of transporting people. Then one of them said, okay, it's time to start the first task. Collecting material will take about 2 hours. What will he do, Kureto? He adjusted the bag on his hand and replied that he would return to the capital, drink a cup of tea, and wait for them. They cried out in surprise. They would fight, sweating, he would drink tea. Cunning. He frowned and replied, such an ability. Besides, wouldn't he only get in their way? They answered that this was true, and then Arna said, well, good luck to them, guys. Rox shouted she decided to run away, and added that she should go to him. Reed waved his hand, asked to pick them up in 2 hours. The protagonist waved back and said, okay, they should be careful. 2 hours later, MC came back and said he came to pick them up. But before he could finish speaking, Elena's blade suddenly appeared near his neck. Turning around, she noticed it was him, and he asked what he did to her. He almost had a heart attack. She put her hands to her chest and said that it was his own fault for appearing so suddenly behind. He replied, yeah, next time he'll move a little to the side. By the way, was the subjugation of the monsters successful? She confirmed it and pointed her finger at the tied-up monster behind her, saying that everything went like clockwork. He was surprised, wow, and thought that was expected of B-rank adventurers. After that, he opened the application and said, then the next destination. Before he could finish speaking, Reed said, first he'd like to ask something. Can I leave my luggage with him for storage? Of course, they'll pay for it. This way they can gather more materials. The protagonist thought, it makes sense. The more quests they take, the more materials they get, and the more luggage they have. In this case, the luggage storage system will be quite convenient for adventurers, and he can earn more money this way. He smiled and held up 3 fingers and said, okay, it will cost 3 bronze coins. He replied that he agreed. It will help them a lot. The protagonist then asked, can they borrow an empty bag of normal size? He replied, of course. Then he picked up the backpack and said, done. They can put their luggage in it. Rox said, Kureto magic. The others have joined. How is this possible? He shouted, what's wrong with them? Reed smiled and explained that they were simply acknowledging his abilities. Although this magic is really too much. He laughed awkwardly and asked, is that so? Okay, we need to go to Galore Forest. The others agreed with him. Thus, the journey to Galore Forest, which took about 4 days by carriage, was covered in the blink of an eye. The Thunder Sword group returned to the capital on the same day, having completed 2 quests that would have been impossible before. They poured out the money they had earned on the table and said with admiration, wow. Reed noticed that there was even more than he expected. Elena said, 6 silver coins are definitely worth it. MC, smiling, said that he hoped that he was able to help them. Then one of them apologized to the protagonist for being suspicious of him at first, but his ability was exactly as he said. Elena, smiling, noticed, he is a good guy. Arna, also smiling cheerfully, said that it was fun. Rox agreed, right? Their group could use such a reliable person. Does he not want to join them? Elena looked at him and said that it was a good idea. The protagonist thanked them for the invitation, but he was not going to remain an adventurer for long. However, he was ready to help them with his services at any time. The Thunder Sword was his first clients, so they were given a discount for a while. Rox said, I understand. Elena told him not to say such things with a happy face. He cried out, it hurt, Elena, and she said, okay, they will continue working with Kureto. The people present were surprised. What? They were already back? They say that in order to earn a name, you need to earn a reputation. Several weeks passed since the start of his new job. All those who had doubts before began to approach him one after another. The number of clients increased and the work became quite stable. Eventually he gave his services a temporary name, transfer service. And then, Kushi shouted irritably, that's right, because of him, Mr. Transfer Service, they are in a complete mess. The protagonist awkwardly scratched the back of his head, smiled, asked her not to call him that. She shouted, what is he saying? A second name is proof of an adventurer's popularity. Didn't he know? That's what it means. She pointed her finger at him and shouted, please, he needs to slow down a bit on carrying adventurers. The parties are currently handling so many requests that they can't keep up. The protagonist said, but the guild leader praised him for his increased quest completion rate, and he came up to him the other day to express his gratitude. She slammed her fists on the table and added, he should already forget about what he said. This old man only shows up at the guild occasionally and barely does his job. He needs to listen. If he keeps this up, the entire staff will die of exhaustion. He apologized. He understood everything. Damn it, He never thought it would come to this. He folded his arms and thought, but he can't force Kushi and the others to work themselves to death. He understands the feelings of a corporate employee too well. By the way, he noticed something these past few days. It seems that his magic power is not infinite. He felt something like fatigue and a decrease in mana when he repeatedly transferred groups of people and stored large luggage. Well, he will take this break and think about his next business. A little later, Emilio, who was walking behind him, asked, "Is this him, the transfer service?" MC turned around in surprise, and he smiled and said hello. He thought, wow, he has the looks of a famous actor. But first of all, who is he exactly? Emilio apologized for being rude, and then introduced himself. He is a merchant doing business in the royal capital. And this is his employee Rodney. The protagonist asked, so what did he want? He replied that he would get straight to the point. Would he like to become his partner? The protagonist was surprised, and then sheepishly apologized and said that he was not one of those. There's no need to force your orientation on everyone. Emilio shouted indignantly that he didn't mean that. That's not what partner meant. MC sighed and asked, is that so? He confused him. He raised his hand to his chin and suggested to forget about it. How about working with his company? The protagonist said he wants him to join their company to do the transfer work. The merchant confirmed this. He had noticed his strength a long time ago. He reached the oak forest in an instant, and the journey there by carriage takes a week and a half. Using his ability to buy and sell goods, they can easily make a profit. He figured it out himself, didn't he? MC thought, it seems he studied him well. This guy gives the impression of a scrupulous and cautious person. Then, he said that he himself was thinking of making money this way. Emilio leaned towards him, smiled, and said that in that case, it makes everything easier. Will he accept his offer? The protagonist shouted anxiously and asked him to wait. Can I clarify the name of this company? He answered positively. Well, it's Emilio's company, and he's the head of the company. Well, he probably figured it out himself. The protagonist answered, I'm sorry, but this is the first time he's heard of such a company. The merchant was surprised. Had he visited the capital's Chamber of Commerce? MC confirmed it. Thought about selling his services. Emilio said it was written all over his face. He answered that it was rude. Did he know? They're telling him this again. The merchant closed his eyes and said, it's no wonder he doesn't know about his company. It was founded quite recently. He was disappointed to learn that it was a very young company, wasn't he? He answered that he was actually going to join a bigger company. He answered, okay, not bad, but it's still not the best choice, frankly speaking. He wouldn't recommend him to work with a big company. The protagonist was surprised. Why? He answered, it's simple. For him it's an extra burden. The bigger the company, the more attached he will be to it, and the earnings will be divided among many people. He thinks that he didn't join any of the groups because he didn't want to lose his freedom, and instead chose to work as a mercenary, calling it a transfer service. He won't like it in a big company because he doesn't like being a simple cog in a big machine. MC wondered, this guy, how long did he follow him? Emilio smiled and said, in this sense his company is much better. Now there are only 2 employees in this one, and he is not going to tie him to work forcibly. He can do it whenever he wants. In addition, he will pay him a fair salary. The protagonist asked in surprise, does he have sales channels? He said that he shouldn't worry about it. He already has the necessary network. The protagonist asked, what about the initial capital? The merchant sighed and noted that he was a rather cautious person. After that, he handed him a bag of money and said that there were 50 gold coins. The protagonist thought, no doubt, with such money you can build a large house in the capital. This is not the amount that a beginner merchant can afford. He's clearly not telling the whole story. Then he said, okay, there's money to buy the goods. Emilio, smiling, said that's not true. This is an advance payment in case he accepts his offer. He shouted in surprise, 50 gold per month? The merchant folded his arms and explained that this is not true for each day. Now he can only pay because the scale is small, but over time the profit will increase. MC asked, is he sure? He answered, of course, with his help. He will be able to earn much more. The protagonist thought, where does he get such confidence from? He asked, so what, does he agree to work for him? The protagonist thought, even if he fails, he does not risk anything. This is a pretty good offer. Maybe he should start small, gradually make the company bigger. Besides, this guy named Emilio interested him a little. After that, the MC, smiling, extended his hand and said that he agreed. He hoped that they would work together. The merchant said that they asked if they could communicate less formally. After that, they shook hands, and he happily said that now Emilio's company is finally formed. A new life in Emilio's company. After a while, the hero opened the door, rubbed his nose, and saw Emilio standing in front of the house with a box in his hands. He wished Emilio good morning, then asked, are they ready to do business yet? Emilio looked at him and said, yeah, good morning. That's right. He looked at Rodney and said, good morning, Rodney. He didn't answer and lowered his head. The protagonist raised his hand and waved at him. Emilio told him not to worry about it, he was just a bit shy. Better let him say, "Did he sleep well today?" The protagonist replied, "Well, pretty good. And by the way, the store was really empty." Emilio noticed that was because he had just bought it. He then pointed his finger forward and continued, however, it would be filled in no time. After they merged, the other stores wouldn't hold a candle to them. MC closed his eyes and thought that he was still in doubt. Emilio added, "By the way, Corretto, he wanted to ask something." The protagonist looked at him and asked, "What was it?" He replied, "About his abilities." Then he asked, "Is there a limit to his transfer magic? How far can he transfer luggage?" He heard that he had a magic storage and wanted to see it in action. It would be easier for him to figure out what direction to focus his business on. The protagonist thought that he had already explained everything. After all, he had conducted research, so he already knew everything about his abilities. Emilio looked at the records and said that now he could travel to any point in the country in an instant. The protagonist asked, "Why ask then?" He raised his hand to his chin and thought, then folded his arms across his chest and asked him to at least show the storage. The protagonist agreed and said, "Now." The protagonist stood in front and heard Emilio ask, "Are you sure nothing will happen to the goods?" He thought. He said that it was safe and specified that he had stored other people's luggage there many times, and there were no problems. And by the way, the products do not spoil there. Emilio asked, "So he can carry food there and it will always be fresh?" MC raised his hand up and said, "That's right, you can buy fresh fish at the port and sell it in the capital." Emilio looked at him and said, "This is great, of course, but putting it on the market is a bad idea. Commoners will avoid this product obtained by unknown means. By briefly explaining the situation to the upper class, they will be able to sell it at a higher price." At this time, the protagonist thought, immediately came up with a way to make the maximum profit. After all, his head is working. Emilio shouted, "Well, then they need to quickly send the goods to the storage." Then they approached a cart full of goods. MC asked in surprise, "A whole cart?" He thought that he would have to get it from each settlement. Emilio folded his hands on his stomach and asked what he was muttering there. "Just don't tell him that it is impossible." At this time, the protagonist stretched out his hand forward. The magic of movement worked. He moved the cart to the storage. Then he smiled and said, "It seems everything is fine." Emilio said, "Apparently, judging by everything, there will be no problems with the movement." Then he bent over and laughed loudly, and the protagonist turned and looked at him in surprise and said, "Well, he's surprised." Emilio wiped away tears of laughter with his hand and apologized. It was not for nothing that he addressed him. The protagonist thought, "What kind of villainous laughter is this?" He got angry, looked at him seriously. In response, Emilio said that he was joking. Even without taking this risk, they can still make a lot of money. The protagonist calmed down, put his hand on his chest and said that there is no need for such jokes, and added, "Now everything is clear. They need to get to work." At that very moment, they were transported to the village. Donker village. He looked in different directions, smiled and said, "They really were instantly transported to Donker." The protagonist looked at him and thought, "Isn't he tired of reacting so emotionally to everything?" and asked, "So why did they come here?" He answered, he still doesn't guess. After all, he has been here before, only for work. He pointed his finger into the distance and said that he will explain everything now. They are now near the border of Madhet country. There is a lot of trade here. Then he asked, does he know what products Madhet supplies? The protagonist said he does, a large selection of spices and dried fish, as well as delicate fabrics. He shouted, "That's right, in Donker the price of these goods is almost the same as in Madhet. In other words, they will buy the goods cheaply." The protagonist asked, "Where does such a difference in price come from?" He folded his arms across his chest and answered, "On the side of the royal capital, there are many steep mountains and a lot of nasty monsters, so merchants and travelers prefer to ignore this village. Surprisingly, almost no one knows about this." He thought, "I see." He continued, "Merchants prefer to pay the duty and go straight to Madhet than to go here." The protagonist thought, last time he did not notice this, because he was just delivering a letter. Emilio knows a lot of things that ordinary people do not know. It's even a little scary. He said, "So they will buy rare goods cheaply and then sell them where they are in short supply?" Emilio spread his arms out to the sides and said that you have to buy cheap and sell expensive. That is the basis of business, although it is difficult to apply this basic principle in practice. They looked at each other, then Emilio smiled and shouted, "But with Kirito magic it will be easy." Then he walked forward, waved his hand at them and shouted, "They need to hurry up and stock up. The local market is not as big as in Madhet, so after this they will go to another point." The protagonist and Rodney followed him. He feels that from now on he will have a lot of work, and so everything started spinning. Their trading company began its activities. As he said, he had to move all over the country. to those places where there was food, handicrafts, textiles, medicine, and materials from monsters that can only be found there. He bought specialized products at a cheap price to sell them where they were needed most. Emilio obtained information and responded flexibly to any situation. His appearance and communication skills came in handy. Before he knew it, their company had grown and become famous throughout the country. And then, 3 months later, the protagonist entered a large, beautiful, all-shiny mansion, walked along the corridor, looking at the house, and thought to achieve this in 3 months. The number of employees also increased. Lately, they had been expanding so quickly that rumors began to circulate that there was no product that Emilio's company could not get. It's good that only a few employees knew about it. If they continued in the same spirit, then in a few years, the company would become so stable and reliable that even his departure would not hinder it. There was a portrait of Emilio on the wall. He looked at it and thought, his business acumen never ceases to amaze him. The protagonist raised his hand, knocked on the door and said, "Emilio, he's coming in." He walked into a huge office where Emilio was sitting at a desk, reading something. He greeted him and said, "Welcome back, Cureto." The protagonist said, "He bought the goods Mr. Zarm got." He said, "Great, he can put them in the storage room." MC replied, "It's done. Nothing can be done. This ore can only be obtained from the Valerio volcano." Emilio continued reading something and said he still can't do without his help. The protagonist opened the door to go out, then turned around and said, "Well, now there's no need to use his skills to buy all sorts of little things. Now he only delivers the rarest items." Emilio closed his eyes, raised his hands, and began to remember. Then he asked if he missed those times. Countless transfers, overtime, and wild fatigue, as if he was working in a black company again. The protagonist approached Emilio, looked at him, and told him not to remind him. In any case, with the current salary, it's a sin to complain. He deserved this money. It's quite natural. That's all for today. The reward is on the table, and he started doing the paperwork. The protagonist looked at him and asked if he had too much work. Emilio looked up and looked at him questioningly. Noticed, well, he still relies on him a lot. This goes against the original promise not to tie Cureto to himself. The protagonist understood. So that's the thing. Of course he asked for freedom, but he shouldn't drive himself like that. He smiled and asked, "So he agrees to work here for the rest of his life?" The protagonist got angry and shouted, "When did he say that?" Emilio said sadly, "Well, that's a pity. Does he really not want to dedicate his life to their team?" The protagonist thought that he doesn't want to, of course. Emilio continued, "But is he sure he earned enough? Their profits are increasing every day, but he would rather enjoy a quiet life instead." MC thought for a while and fell silent. After a while, Emilio closed his eyes, raised his hands and said, "Okay, it's up to him to decide, but as for him, he has a goal, to make this company better in the world, and he would be glad if he helped him." After some time, the protagonist walked down the street, remembered the words, but instead he would prefer to enjoy a quiet life, and he thought that something was bothering him. Having ended up in another world, he just went with the flow, without thinking about what he would do next. The only thing he was busy with was making money. Gradually he stopped thinking about what he really wanted to do, but his original goal was. At that moment, he ran into a man. He shouted at him, "Hey, be careful." The protagonist turned around and apologized to him, then walked on and thought he needed to calmly think about everything in some quiet place. After that, he raised his head up and saw a familiar high-rise building. With one jump, he moved to the balcony of this building and said, "I haven't been here for a long time," put his hand on the railing and continued, "From that very first day in this world." He looked into the distance and remembered the words, "You must use the magic of space to live as you want." He shouted, "Right." Then he indulged in memories. Looking back, he realizes that his work in the guild or in the transfer service was not something bad. He met many good people, and even Emilio, although a little strange but not without talent, and as a boss he has no shortcomings. He cannot say that he is dissatisfied with his current job, but the protagonist stretched out his hands in front of him and said, in the old days, he did not get close to many people. Having lost his mother early, he was afraid that something like this would happen again, so he preferred not to have close ties. But having lost his father, he realized that now he has no close people left. He folded his hands on the railing, laid his head on them, closed his eyes and thought, now everything is a little better. But even with Emilio, he has more of a business relationship. Friends, deep relationships with people, something similar to his hometown, a place where he would feel at ease. At that moment, he remembered the girl Nina, who was seeing him off, looking at him and shouting, "Corretto!" He would come to them again, right? They would see each other next time so that he would not rush to leave. And it dawned on him, that's right, this village, that family, they wanted to see him again. He looked into the distance and said he would like to live in Howin village. That's right, he wouldn't mind living a quiet life there. Then he thought about it, but he couldn't leave the company now. Emilio still needed his help, if only he could. At that moment, he He grabbed the railing with his hands, got angry, and shouted, "In general, everything can be solved with the help of spatial magic. Thanks to it, he can live in the village and in the royal capital at the same time. It will be a life on two bases. He was tired of loneliness and now he wants to live a happy life, value his connections with people, and do whatever he wants. Isn't that why he was given this power?" He said, "It's decided. He will live on two bases, moving between the capital and the village. Why not?" Finally, he found the life he wants to live. And at this time, a girl named Nina was walking in the field, weaving a wreath. Suddenly, she looked up, looked ahead, and saw a man approaching her. The protagonist waved his hand and said, "Hi, it's been a long time since we've seen each other." She looked at him in fear, and he asked, "Does she remember him?" Then he added, he had been to this village before. Well, they had dinner together, and he stayed with them for the night. She asked him again about the royal capital. She continued to look at him in surprise, and he sadly said, "I see." Suddenly she recognized him and screamed, "Is that him, Kureto?" She began to spin around him and ask a lot of questions. What is he doing here? He came for work again. Will he stay with them for the night? How is he doing? He sat down, exhaled, and said, "Thank God." She stopped, looked at him in surprise, and asked, "Is something wrong?" He closed his eyes and answered, "No, he was just here once, and so he thought that they might have forgotten him." She shouted that she had not forgotten. That's right, Andre remembered him too, but he was afraid that they had already forgotten about him here. She smiled and replied she would never forget him. The day he came was so much fun. She thanked him for keeping his promise and coming to visit her. He thanked her in return, and they headed towards the house. Stella opened the door, put her hand to her mouth, and shouted in surprise, "Kureto, he really came back?" He smiled and answered, "That's right, it's been a long time, Stella." She agreed with him and added, "That's right, she's glad to see him." Then Andre pointed his finger at her and said, "He told her," but she didn't believe it. Stella got angry, clenched her fists, and said, "There is simply no work here." Then she asked, "Will he stay overnight?" He answered, "He will, if it is not too much trouble." She added, "Then we need to prepare a bed." Meanwhile, Nina stood next to the protagonist and said, "Kureto will spend the night in her room." Andre shouted that this is unacceptable. They began to argue. He repeated, "What? But why?" A warm family atmosphere. Later, they sat down at the table and the protagonist asked, "By the way, will there be a problem because he left his post?" Andre answered, "There will not be." Another guard took his place. When he saw how they met, he immediately understood that this was for a long time. The protagonist drank wine, looked at them, and thought, no wonder he immediately liked this village. Andre asked, "By the way, Kureto, what business does he have here?" Another delivery quest. He did not agree and said that in fact he was thinking of settling in this village. They were very surprised, and Stella said, "Seriously?" Andre was very happy and shouted, "Great, they can go fishing together." Nina clenched her fists and shouted happily, "Hooray, now she will play with Kureto every day." The protagonist looked at them and thought, they were much happier than he thought. Suddenly Stella said in a serious voice for them both to calm down a little. She was happy, of course, but what about his work? Andre calmed down and said, "It's true, the style of clothes is the same, but the material is much better. Are things going well in the capital?" The protagonist answered, "That's right, now he makes money doing trade, and he is not going to quit." He looked at him and asked, "Is that so?" The protagonist continued, "Naturally, it will not be possible to do business here, so he will continue to work in the royal capital." They looked at him in bewilderment. He looked at them and said that he understands their confusion. In general, it is hard to believe, but his magic will allow him to continue working in the capital. This skill will help him live in two places at once. Andre turned to his wife and said, "You can't just move in an instant." The protagonist proudly said, "You can do it. That's exactly what his magic can do." He shouted at him to calm down. Andre said that he had never heard of such magic. The protagonist replied, "No wonder. He thought it would be better to show it visually." They looked at each other in surprise, and Andre asked again, "Show it?" He replied that he would transport the three of them to the royal capital. Nina was delighted and screamed, "Really?" Andre didn't believe him and said, "My God, Kureto, he really got carried away from one glass." Suddenly they found themselves on one of the streets of the royal capital. Andre screamed, "What? What the hell? What's going on?" Stella looked at him in surprise, put her hand to her mouth and said, "It looks like Zarala Castle," then sighed and added, "It really is the royal capital." Nina was overwhelmed with emotions. She raised her hands to her chest, clenched her fists, and screamed, "Amazing! The royal capital! What big buildings and so many people." The protagonist looked at her and thought, a child's psyche is quite flexible. Andre asked, "Is this a dream?" Stella said that she could pinch him, and pinched him. He screamed. Andre held his hand near his cheek and said that's enough for him to return them home. The protagonist answered, "Okay," and thought, poor thing. They stood next to each other, and in that moment they were home. Andre said, "Home, sweet home." Nina screamed, "Are they home already?" She was just getting into the swing of it. The protagonist apologized to her and said he would move her there some other time. She looked at him and screamed. Really? She takes him at his word. Then she ran up to him and hugged him. He wondered if she was too smart for her age. She thought, now I understand what kind of magic Kureto has. Andre asked, so he wants to live both here and there? But won't that cost a pretty penny? The protagonist raised his hand, folded his fingers and said not to worry, he makes good money. He asked, what is that city slang? Then he added, well, he's only too happy about it. Welcome to Hourin village. They hope to live together in peace. Andre suggested that he come to him if there are any problems, and shouted, sure, they will celebrate. Nina shouted that she agreed. Stella said, then we should cook something delicious tonight. Nina shouted that she will help. Andre praised her and said that he will have a drink with Kureto for now. He is already drunk. MC smiled and said, of course. He suggested that they continue to be friends. Life on two bases. The next day, the protagonist sat on the step near the door and thought, oh, and yet he overdid it with drinking last night. Then he stood up and looked into the distance. The clear sky seemed to reflect Kureto's state of mind. Afterwards, he thought, wonderful air and picturesque landscape. It was not for nothing that he decided to live in this village. Finding himself in another world, he can finally relax. He went for a walk and said, good choice. Okay, first we need to figure out housing. Meanwhile, Nina was running after him. She caught up with him, hugged him around the waist and shouted, Kureto. She looked at him and added, good morning. He answered her, good morning. She asked what they were going to do today. He replied that he himself did not know yet. She suggested that he would like to look at the cherry blossoms or take a walk near the stream. Before he could answer, Andre appeared from behind and said that they needed to find him a house. Nina asked in surprise, what's wrong with him, Dad? The protagonist said, good morning, Andre. He looked at them sternly and said, morning. They were standing too close. The protagonist moved away from the girl a little and asked, by the way, how do you get a house in this village? Andre looked at him and asked, in what sense? He raised his hand to his chin and explained, well, in the capital, you first need to buy citizenship and then buy a house from a real estate agency. Then you need to submit documents to the town hall. Is there something similar in the village? Andre scratched his chin, thought about it and said, here in the countryside there's no such bureaucracy. MC wondered, and what instead of it? He smiled and said loudly, exactly. You need permission from the village headman. Then he can settle in an empty house or build a new one on an empty lot. It's always like this in villages. The protagonist asked in surprise, is that all? Andre asked, nothing complicated, right? The protagonist looked at them, agreed and asked, but will they give him permission? Andre closed his eyes and asked, does he think they won't accept him because it's too sudden? The protagonist thought about it and said, well, after his words. At that moment, Andre smiled, put his arm around the protagonist's shoulders and shouted at him not to worry. He's one of our guys, he'll vouch for him. He's not some kind of vagabond. He even delivered a money transfer here. He doesn't think the village chief will refuse. Kureto asked, is that so? Nina walked next to him and told him not to worry, she'll put in a good word too. He thanked her. They approached the house and Andre said, okay, we should have breakfast first. He can already smell the wonderful aroma. The protagonist said, sure. After breakfast, they went to the village elder. They entered the building and were met by the village elder Hourin. He listened to them and said, well, he roughly understood the situation. Then he looked at the protagonist and said, so he has unusual magical abilities. The protagonist apologized for scaring him. Nina said, actually, she was the one who wanted to move. Andre said menacingly, it's too early for her, Nina. Leroy thought about it and said, well, after learning more about him and receiving Andre's recommendation, he has no reason to refuse. The protagonist was happy and thanked him. Then he folded his hands to his chin and asked, he wanted to ask him one question. Why did he choose their village? If you want a quiet place, then there's a village with better conditions. With magic like his, there are many options. The protagonist turned to Andre and Nina and said, how to say, he doesn't have a family or any place to call home. Until he came here, he lived completely immersed in work. And then he remembered the words his father told him, to live the life he wants to live. Then he continued. Andre and the others were kind to him then, even though he was an unfamiliar adventurer to them, and they said that they would always be glad to see him here. It was because of this warm atmosphere that he wanted to settle here and not somewhere else. Settling in this village is exactly the life he wants to live. Leroy looked at him and replied. Now he understood his motive and was glad that he had such a good opinion of their village. Then he welcomed him with all his heart. From now on, he is a resident of Hourin village. The protagonist exhaled, closed his eyes and said, everything went smoothly. Nina shouted happily. She was glad that he was accepted. He agreed and added, it seems like he is a good person. By the way, why is Andre trailing behind? He leaned over to the girl and she whispered in his ear, embarrassed when he said that he liked them. MC hugged the girl, smiled and said, modest. Andre shouted back displeasedly, not at all. It's just that no one says it to your face. The protagonist thought, really, you don't hear such confessions often. He shouted, okay, so they'll forget about it. After a while, he held the keys in his hands and smiled and said, the headman gave permission, so they'll go through the empty houses. He was given the keys. He needs to think about what he'll do, build a new house or do repairs. The protagonist shouted, and really? Then he put his hand to his chin and thought, he doubts that it's worth building a house from scratch, and he'd like to settle in as soon as possible. He can afford a more expensive house. It's better to choose the option with repairs. So they slowly walked to the center of the village and asked, they are in the center of the village, then we'll start from here? The protagonist agreed. And here is the first house. They went inside the house, and Andre said, it's old, but they look after it, so you can move in right now. The protagonist answered, I see. It's not bad, of course, but I'd like more. Andre supported him and said, really? Well, he deliberately didn't start with the best option, but it's in the center, so it's easier to get to any place from here. He answered, I see. Andre continued, I doubt such a trifle will bother you, Corrado. He said, that's right. They left the house and headed further. Then Andre said, why don't they look at the house in the mountains? The protagonist answered that it sounded tempting. At this time, Nina ran after them and shouted, where are they in such a hurry? After a while, when they had already walked around and looked at many houses, Andre asked, did they like any? The protagonist answered, yes, they are all good. Usually, logistics is a decisive factor, but not in his case. He closed his eyes and thought, there are only more of them, there are too many options, so he doesn't know where to stop. Andre turned, walked, and then said, okay, there is one more house left. The protagonist apologized and said they had wasted a lot of time on him. He replied, it was nothing. He had said right away that he would help. Then they reached the last house. The protagonist looked and said, this is the place. Nina spread her arms in different directions and shouted that their house was visible from here. Andre turned and said, it was practically next door, so he felt awkward offering it right away. The protagonist walked to the side, pointed his finger towards the house and asked, does anyone live there? It looks neat. He agreed and said, the owners moved in only 3 months ago. The protagonist said, I see. Then he nudged Andre with his elbow and jokingly asked, was he embarrassed to offer him to be his neighbor? Andre smiled and shouted for him to shut up. The protagonist closed his eyes and, smiling, said loudly, but in vain. Being with neighbors is not so bad. It already looks more attractive than the previous options. They looked at him. Then Andre covered his face with his hand and asked displeasedly, why the hell is he talking so directly? Right to the forehead. The protagonist pointed to the door and asked if they could get inside. He said he would open it now. Then they went inside the house. It was big. They began to look around and wonder. A spacious living room. A large family used to live here. Andre crossed his arms over his chest and asked if it was too big for him alone. The protagonist turned to him and answered, it was small. He was not a fan of cleaning, so it was okay. And besides, he could organize a warehouse here. Then he heard Nina's voice, who was coming down the stairs and calling him. She was shouting for him to look at the second floor. He replied that he was coming. He went up to the second floor and saw that there were a couple more rooms. He thought, really too much for one person, but they could be used as a pantry and a guest room. Nina ran on, then shouted for him to come here. Then she grabbed his hand. He followed her and asked, what is it? Then they saw an exit from the back of the house. He said, a back exit with a view of nature. She shouted, right, isn't it great? There's a stream nearby. If you listen, you can hear the sound of the waves. He raised his hand to his ear and said, that's right. Then he looked at her and added, she knows a lot about this house. She smiled and said that she had been playing with the owner's children before they left. He answered, I see. He closed his eyes and said, in good weather you can put a chair here and bask in the sun. Then Andre came to them and asked, did he like it too? Andre continued, he secretly makes a fire in the backyard, eats processed cheese with sausages and drinks ale. The main character smiled and shouted, what? Sounds amazing, it's decided, he will live here. Andre asked, is he sure? The protagonist agreed and shouted, this house is perfect. Andre said loudly, okay, then he will tell the old man. The protagonist agreed, he is so glad that he found a good house. The next day, he invited workers to do some minor repairs. The protagonist watched the workers, suddenly heard a familiar voice from behind, which asked, so he will not do a major renovation? He turned around, saw Andre and answered, he will not. He is fine with everything. He will only change the kitchen and hallway a little. He thought to make them more like his home. Then he closed his eyes and thought that he wanted to move here as soon as possible. His dream house. Andre raised his hand up and suggested, now that everything is settled, why don't they go fishing? He was surprised. Fishing? Sounds great. Andre agreed and added, with the Corrado skill they will quickly get to the mountain stream. The protagonist said that he can only move to where he has already been. Then he thought, and yet how great it is to live in the village. That the fish here are very tasty. The protagonist reached out to Andre and shouted, exactly. Then he apologized and continued. He was going to go back to the capital today to report on the situation. He chuckled and said, I see. Then he asked, by the way, he has been here for a few days already. Are you sure they won't fire him? The protagonist replied, it's a pretty flexible job, so they shouldn't. He thought, he relaxed too much in the village. To be honest, he doesn't think there's a lot of work. Emilio won't let that happen. Since he's going there, he should look for some furniture. Then he turned around and shouted, okay. Then he's gone. They'll go fishing when he gets back, and disappeared. Andre said, this magic never ceases to amaze. At this time, Nina ran to her father and shouted, Dad, where is Corrado? He replied, he left for the capital. She was upset. What, boring? He asked her to pity him. Meanwhile, the protagonist was already standing on the street of the royal capital and said, great. Then he raised his hands up and shouted, it's been a while since he's walked the streets of the capital. He looked around and said, it's so lively here. Okay, I need to visit Emilio and make sure everything is okay. The furniture can wait. He came out from behind the corner and thought, by the way, you can also have a good lunch in the capital. Suddenly he heard a voice and got scared, which said, hello, Mr. Corrado. He looked at the boy standing near the wall and asked, Rodney? What is he doing here? And that he shouldn't scare them like that. Rodney answered, Emilio said that he would be back soon, so he told him to wait for him. The protagonist raised his hands, pressed them to his heart, and asked displeasedly, what a horror. Does he predict his movements? He went to the office and asked, is there some urgent work? Rodney answered, he doesn't know. Maybe. MC continued, then he will ask him himself, is he with him? Later they came to a large building, Emilio's company. The protagonist walked into the office and said, hi. Emilio was sitting at the table and said, so it seems like someone came back. The protagonist asked in surprise, what's wrong? He warned that he would not be there. He raised his hand and said, that's right. Still, he was there much longer than he thought. The protagonist apologized and said that he got a little carried away. Emilio moved his hand to the side and said, it's not that he had any urgent business, he was just gone for a long time, so he was worried. Then he asked with interest, so did he find it? A place where he can enjoy life? The protagonist told him, and after listening, he added, I see, life between Howin village and the royal capital? There must be something to it. The protagonist raised his hand up, agreeing with him, and said he always dreamed of a comfortable big house in nature. Besides, Howin village is a beautiful place. There are a lot of good people there. He smiled and added, he thinks he made the right decision. Emilio looked at him and continued, even looked prettier. Apparently, life between two bases gives him real pleasure. If this is his decision, he will respect it. The protagonist said that he is not going to kill himself for the company, but he is not going to quit his job either. Emilio said, well, that is quite enough. Their company continues to expand, so there are always orders that only he can fulfill. The protagonist answered that it is clear. He added, by the way, Corrado, since he is going to live on two bases, he needs a house in the capital as well. The protagonist was surprised and said, there are enough hotels here. After these words, Emilio jumped up, put his hands on the table and shouted, no, Corrado, you must have your own house. Then he raised his hand to his face, extended his finger and continued, if you live in an inn, he will not know when he will return. Besides, Rodney won't be able to wait for him outside all the time, and if he waits for him inside, the hotel owners won't like it. He doesn't want to ruin his relationship with them. But if he has his own house, he can wait for him there as long as he wants. The protagonist thought about it and answered, he's probably right. Emilio pointed at him and said loudly, if he's going to live on two bases, he should buy himself a second house. The protagonist asked, really? That makes sense. Emilio raised his hands, smiled and said, of course. MC thought, where did such enthusiasm come from? Then he suggested that he could hire a servant to deliver the message. The protagonist didn't like this proposal and shouted, what? He disagreed and said, a servant is too much. Emilio asked, what does he think? He answered that, of course he earned a decent amount, but the proletariat is not used to luxury. He thought that he shouldn't get involved in all this. He's not some kind of bourgeois after all. Emilio continued to reason. And yes, Corrado, if he had two houses, would he be able to keep them clean? Even with one house, he would be tired of cleaning. It wasn't a cramped hovel, was it? If he didn't use it regularly, a week would be enough for it to get dirty. Well, if he had two, maintaining them himself would be a real hassle. Isn't that right? The protagonist said he was right. Emilio smiled and asked in a satisfied voice, does that mean you agree? He raised his hand to his neck and said, that's why if he had a house here, it would be better to hire servants for it. They looked at each other, and the protagonist understood, and then said, is he going to store goods there while he's away? Emilio agreed, and then added, right, there's nothing wrong with that, right? With his connections, he'll buy the property at a discount. He said, yeah, right. Emilio suggested that he not worry about the servants. He'll take care of them too. The protagonist got angry and thought, he doesn't even hide it. And then the day of the house inspection came. The protagonist walked down the street and thought, how did it come to this? The house is in the royal capital. He remembered their conversation and thought, Emilio got too excited. He smirked and said, he has a bad feeling about this. Then he remembered that he still hasn't bought furniture for the house in Howin. MC put his fingers to his chin and thought, well, actually Emilio is right. At least he has the right connections. He walked on and thought, okay, it's time to inspect the house. Suddenly, a girl came out from around the corner and they bumped shoulders. He apologized and asked, is she okay? She agreed and also apologized, then moved on. He turned around and looked at her and thought, beautiful and well-dressed. An aristocrat? It seemed that life in a new house in the royal capital would not be as he imagined. And so the next day they went to inspect the house. Coming closer, he saw a large mansion and did not believe it. Said, no way, what the hell, Emilio? Why does he need such a huge mansion? He turned to him and replied, the bigger the better, right? The protagonist shouted, but not that big. It is too big. Besides, the main house is in the village. Emilio continued, stop complaining, the maids can handle it. Besides, he will take care of the discount because he wanted to live in a nice house. The protagonist agreed, but at this time, the realtor intervened in the conversation and said, a friend of Mr. Emilio, they would like to show their best goods. There is a wide selection of real estate for every taste. Then, she looked at the protagonist and added, all he had to do was say so, and she would find the right house. He replied, okay, and thought he wouldn't be surprised if she worked for Emilio too. Then Emilio clapped his hands and shouted, that's enough. Time is money. They have to inspect it from the inside. Looked at him and asked why he was so cheerful, as if he was buying it for himself. He asked, what? Isn't it fun to look for a house for a friend? Kureto turned away, scratched his nose and thought, that sounds pretty awkward. Emilio walked forward and said, by the way, there's a great view from here and there's a big company next door. Then he turned around, folded his arms, smiled and asked, why doesn't he take it? The protagonist barked, what a fool. He asked, don't you like it? The protagonist shouted in displeasure, he's next to the company. Too close, how can you relax? Emilio raised his hand to his chin and said, that's too bad. You have to be careful with this guy. They looked at the whole house, got out and walked on. They were approaching another house, and the protagonist, looking around, found that it was a pretty quiet, peaceful area for the royal capital. The realtor turned around and said, an aristocrat used to live there, but now the house has been empty for 3 years. It's a bit far from the center, but it's safe and quiet here. Then she pointed to the side and said, here it is, and they approached the house. The protagonist looked at it and said, wow, it just feels cozy. Emile raised his hand to his chin and noticed that it didn't look like a rich man's house. It was too classic a design. The realtor approached the gate and said, the aristocrat who lived here before preferred a simple life. The protagonist followed her and said, I see. Then he thought, so the previous owner had similar tastes. It's much more peaceful to live in such a quiet place. They entered the yard, and she asked if they wanted to go inside. They answered, of course. Then they went into the house and were surprised at how big and beautiful it was inside. The protagonist walked down the hallway, looked around and said, but in terms of size, it is not inferior to that mansion, but the atmosphere is much calmer. The realtor said that he was right. The difference in size and number of rooms is minimal. Besides, all their houses are equipped with artifacts of fire and water magic. He closed his eyes and answered, very convenient. She looked at the document and said, another feature of this house is that there's a bathroom. He was surprised and screamed, is she kidding? They went into the bathroom. He saw the size of the room, spread his arms out in surprise and screamed, wow, so big. Emilio noticed, by the way, he is obsessed with cleanliness, right? He washes every day. The protagonist looked at him and asked, what's unusual about that? Then he folded his arms across his chest and thought, well, in this world it is not customary to take a bath often. He heard that even women wash once every 3 days. He had to go to public baths all the time just to soak in the hot water. He was Japanese after all. Then he said loudly, it's decided, he's taking the house. Name the price. Emilio turned to him and asked, did you like it that much? At that time, the realtor said, usually she would set the price at 500 gold, but Mr. Emilio's friend agreed to sell it for 400. The protagonist thought in surprise, this is a pretty low price for the local real estate market, and said, then. Then Emilio interrupted him, said that he did not agree, and asked, can't they sell it for less? The protagonist turned and looked at him in surprise, and the realtor said, okay, 380. But only for them. Emilio kept his arms folded on his chest and offered, the goods they wanted, he could sell at a discount. He was sure it would please their boss. They began to bargain. The realtor said, okay, 300 gold. A little later, she got a little angry and said, no. Then 250. He thought about it and then said it would probably be much more profitable for him to sell it without a discount, so that she would forget about this conversation. She nervously screamed, "How about 150 gold coins?" The protagonist watched what was happening on the sidelines and thought this conversation was starting to scare him. At that moment, Emilio smiled and shouted, "Well, they are completely fine with it. They are taking this house." She thanked him. The protagonist thought about it. Even though he had bargained for a great discount, for some reason he felt uneasy. Then he called him and said discontentedly, did he lower the price on purpose so that he would work more later? Emilio answered, "How suspicious he is, Kureto." He continued, "He is right, this product is very valuable, so he will have to deliver it himself." Then he asked sarcastically, he didn't think that he would lower the price just like that, did he? At that moment, he waved his hands, smiled and shouted, "Okay, he is joking. The goods are already in the warehouse. He is glad that he bought the house at such a cheap price. He just wanted to free up some space in the warehouse." The protagonist looked at him in surprise, replied, "Yeah," and thought, Emilio is scaring him. Merchants are scary people. Thus, he got a house in a good area. 3 days later, they were walking down the street of the city, and the protagonist shouted in surprise, "What? Everything is ready already? Is it too early?" Emilio raised his hand and replied, it was in good condition, so it was quickly tidied up. The protagonist listened and asked, "What about the furniture?" Emilio hesitated, said, "Well, he asked them to hurry up a little." The protagonist continued the conversation and asked, "Are you sure he didn't overdo it? These are their clients." He affirmatively said that everything is fine, they will still get their profit. He has already taken care of the servants. MC thought, he really said something. At this time, they approached the house. They were met by a servant who asked, "What would you like, master?" The protagonist was very surprised and asked him to wait. "Are they already here?" Then Emilio opened the door and they walked in. A servant girl greeted them and said, "Welcome." They were eagerly awaiting his arrival, Lord Kurito. Then he saw 3 more servant girls. He was surprised and asked him to wait. "Are these girls the servants?" They were a little different from what he imagined. She continued, "From today on, she has been assigned to manage Lord Kurito's mansion." She looked down and introduced herself. Her name is Elsa Walker, the head maid. "It's nice to meet you." He responded by agreeing and thought, what the hell? He grabbed Amelia, shook her and yelled. He didn't tell him that he would hire young girls. He asked, "What's wrong with that?" "It's a feast for men's eyes." He got angry and barked. "What? That's the problem." Then he turned to the maid and asked, "Is her last name Walker? So she's an aristocrat?" She looked at him, agreed and said that she was from the Walker line, the 4th daughter of a humble viscount family, so he should not worry. Meanwhile, he pointed to the maids behind her and asked, "Wait, does that mean the other servants too?" He did not have time to finish, as Elsa answered they were from the baronial families. Then these girls introduced themselves. One said her name was Larasha Elfior. Another said she was Lulua Mistolt, and the third introduced herself. She was Archa Landora, and it was nice to meet them. Elsa continued, they all applied for an internship at Emilio's company to gain experience. Then Emilio raised his hand and asked to speak and said, "It is not unusual for the daughters of noble families to sometimes serve as servants." The protagonist turned to him and was indignant. Emilio, why the hell did he appoint these girls to his mansion? At this time, Emilio began to look at his hair and asked, does he not understand what he is talking about? It seemed like the ends were splitting. The protagonist continued to be indignant, so he wouldn't play dumb. In this world, with the exception of special races, everyone with a last name was an aristocrat. However, not all nobles were of the upper class, and often younger children went into service. But, he thought, but that wasn't the problem. He knew the families of all these girls. They were business partners. So that's why her last name sounded so familiar, but that was just the tip of the iceberg. Judging by their appearance, these girls were between 12 and 15 years old. Even the head maid, Elsa, was clearly not even 20 yet. It smelled like a crime. He covered his face with his hands and thought, servants who were higher in status than him? How could he relax here? And anyway, is it normal to use girls like this? Then Emilio smiled and teased him that he was lucky. He would live surrounded by beauties. He shouted discontentedly, there's nothing good about this. And anyway, why did he only choose girls? He asked, should he have taken men? He looked at him and clarified, well, when he comes home tired, the sight of beautiful women calms him down more than the sight of stern men. He muttered, did he check? And he already has a house in the village to relieve stress. He didn't ask for something like that in the royal capital. He raised his hand to his chin, thought for a moment, and said, so his muse lives in Howin village? The protagonist looked at him seriously and asked, what? Emilio laughed and asked, did he guess right? And he added, well, when they met, he immediately made it clear that he was not into men, so he did not understand why he was so unhappy. He understood it that way. The protagonist asked again, Is the muse in the village? Then he thought, Mina will never be her. They will kill him for just thinking about it. He quietly said that he just wants to live a quiet life and does not plan to start an affair yet. Emilio replied that he thinks like an old man. Later, they were sitting on the sofas in the living room opposite each other. Elsa came in and asked if they would like a cup of tea. He agreed and said that she was so kind. The protagonist added that he would like it without sugar. Elsa said, as you say, and began pouring tea into mugs. The protagonist turned and watched her do it with embarrassment. Emilio watched him and said that he looked awkward. He answered irritably, how will he calm down when maids, who are also aristocrats, walk around his house? And Emilio added, by the way, at work he noticed that he does not like to give orders. The protagonist answered because he had never done anything like that before, and thought, he can't get rid of the habits of a simple servant so quickly. At that time, Elsa handed him a cup and said, please, and he thanked her. She added, with all due respect, Mr. Corretto, they are now his servants, so they are lower in status than him. There is no need for such polite addresses. Emilio said, she is right. If you say that, it will be unclear who is the master and who is the servant. He looked at him and answered displeasedly, but he decided to support her? And yet, it is difficult to get used to something like that quickly. She suggested, then please get used to it gradually. He smiled and said, okay, and thanked her for the advice. At that time, Emilio got ready and quickly left. The protagonist looked at her and said that he understood her, and then thought, although she is very beautiful, she is sometimes a little scary. Later he went outside, raised his hands up and said thoughtfully, as soon as Emilio left, he immediately felt uneasy, so he decided to go out too, and thought, however, the discussion of the contract with the maids went too quickly. Where was he rushing? Wasn't he having a day off today? But Elsa, of course, surprised, she didn't even bat an eyelid when she heard about his magic. Emilio clarified, if they broke the contract, Corretto, it would haunt them for the rest of their lives. She screamed, what was she to him, an assassin? He walked down the street and thought, it seemed that Archie took his words seriously, but the Ice Queen didn't care. It was obvious, an aristocrat. Suddenly he heard someone calling him. He turned around and saw Reed, then asked, is it really him? Then they went into the tavern, sat down at the table, and the protagonist asked, it's been a while, how are you? Reed replied, well, he's doing well. He's been away, so he's had to get rid of some lazy habits, but overall, everything's fine. The protagonist smiled and said he recognizes the old Reed. Then he asked, what about the others? Reed replied, well, the ladies went to the public bathhouse, and Rox decided to have a drink with his old guild friends. Today is their day off. The protagonist replied, I see. He crossed his arms near his chin and thought, the bath, now he can always take one when he gets home. Still, buying this house was not in vain. Then Reed asked, how's he doing? Does he work for a company now? The protagonist said, well, actually. Reed turned to him and shouted, he bought a mansion in the best part of the capital, and he even has a servant. Then he adjusted his glasses on his nose and asked, does working there really bring in that much money? Can he tell me more? The MC refused, adding that it was confidential information. Then Reed said, yeah, he was joking, but having your own house would be nice. He took a sip and said, well, buying the house was planned in advance, but he didn't expect there to be maids. Plus, they were all daughters of noble families. He didn't know how to talk to their parents now. Reed leaned on his hand and asked, is that so? He envied him. The protagonist apologized and added, it wasn't bragging, he was genuinely worried. Reed said thoughtfully, it was understandable. They were still young and inexperienced. It was their first time, so they must be feeling awkward. He then drank and continued. After all, they also had to start somewhere. As a young adventurer, he had a series of failures, and his hands often dropped. But if the guild's leadership is reliable, then an adventurer also has something to rely on. He knows that it's hard for him to suddenly take on subordinates, but he must be firm for their own good. They drank some more, and later the protagonist went outside and said, it's true, even if they look calm, this is their first job. He walked down the street and thought, he knows better than anyone how hard it is when your boss is a wimp. In that case, he needs to be firm. With these thoughts, he reached home and quietly walked to his room. After a while, Elsa knocked on his door. He abruptly opened the door and said, he's home. She got scared and just screamed. He looked at her and apologized for scaring her. She replied that she was the one asking for forgiveness for being so scared. He thought, that's true. Even though she looks cold, she's still a young and inexperienced girl. Then he added, although it's a bit early, he'd like to take a bath. Maybe she should prepare it? She smiled and said, sure, she'll organize everything now. He looked at her and thought, really, there's nothing wrong with that. Then he will try to be a good host and, smiling, said, in that case. After a while, Elsa came into the kitchen and was surprised to see him, then said she thought he had gone out to dinner. He replied that he had just had a drink. Elsa said sadly that there were no cooks among them, at least not now. He raised his hand to his head and said he hadn't thought of that, then he should order delivery from a restaurant. Elsa raised her finger to her mouth, thought for a moment and suggested, but if he wants, they can cook for him, of course. They can't compete with professional cooks. He exclaimed in surprise, really? They can cook? Well, then he doesn't mind. After a while, he sat at the table, looked at the food, and said, they prepared surprisingly traditional food. He likes how it looks. It's delicious. She agreed and added that although they were aristocrats, they were from small border towns, and there was not much difference between them and ordinary people. He looked at her and said, I see. The protagonist began to eat dinner and thought it was true that daughters who went into service had no right to inherit. Many of them were married off to members of other families. But the fourth or fifth daughter could only hope to marry a knight or merchant of lower status, or become a concubine. I wonder if this was some kind of training before marriage? It was not easy for them. Then it occurred to him, wait, could it be that they were sent here to drag Emilio down the aisle? And it was true. He had gotten away from here too quickly. He mentally decided that it was better not to even think about it. The dinner was delicious, and that night he slept soundly. The next morning he opened his eyes, looked around the room, sat up and thought, waking up in luxury. No matter what anyone says, and life in the royal capital is not so bad. Then he went into the bathroom and thought, and there's a bath. Now he can take it at least every day. And pamper himself as much as he wants, a great way to get rid of fatigue. Although at first there were some difficulties, he somehow got rid of them. Suddenly Elsa entered the bathroom and said that she would rub his back. He turned away abruptly and screamed, no need, he himself. She clarified, is he sure? Later he began to get dressed and thought, okay, it's time to do some business. The hero was going down the stairs. Elsa asked him, Mr. Kureto, what are his plans for today? He stopped near her and answered, the repairs in the other house should be finished by now. So he is going to the village. He will return to the capital in about 3 days. Emilio knows, but for her to warn him just in case. She answered, understood. Gradually he gets used to Elsa and the others. He asked her to look after the mansion in his absence. She said, okay, he can rely on them. Then she called him. He turned around and she wished him a good day. He thanked her and said that he was leaving. The protagonist left the mansion, and at the same moment, with the help of magic, he found himself in the village. He approached the house, looked at it, and joyfully exclaimed, great, everything is ready. Then he thoughtfully said, but he didn't ask to work on the exterior. Then he added, he liked the way they painted the walls. The protagonist looked behind the house and said, and there is a small garden here. He smiled and thought, the changes are minor, but this is enough to ennoble the appearance. After that, he approached the front door and said, well, it's time to go inside. He began to tug at the handle and asked in surprise, is it locked? After trying to open it several times, he got angry and shouted, damn, I need a key. He walked away from the door and thought, nothing surprising. After all, he himself asked to change the door. Naturally, the lock is now different, and he does not have a new key. He went to the exit and said he does not know where the carpenter lives. The protagonist thought, there is no choice, he will have to look in on the village headman. Suddenly, he heard a familiar voice shouting at him, Kureto, welcome back, Kureto. He turned around, saw a girl waving at him, and shouted back, Nina. She added, she has a key to his house. He was happy and shouted back, really? Thank goodness. It's good that they are neighbors. She ran towards him and said, I'll get it now. He stopped, folded his arms across his chest and told her not to hurry. Then she put the key in his hand and shouted, here's a new key. He thanked her, was about to leave, but looked back and saw that she was looking at him with her big eyes. He asked, what's wrong? She replied, can she have a look too? The protagonist said, of course, Nina will be his first guest. She exclaimed happily, really? She clenched her fists and shouted, hooray! She will be Kureto's first guest, she can't wait. He looked at her and thought, so energetic. After all, children are cute. He's not interested in romance right now, but maybe he'll want to start a family someday. Well, he doesn't have anyone in mind right now. Nina ran ahead and yelled at him to go faster, Kureto. He tried to catch up with her and asked her to wait a little. After a while, they opened the door, entered the house, and were surprised. She looked around and screamed, it's beautiful, the atmosphere has changed a lot. He told her to wait. She turned around and asked, what's the matter? He was holding slippers in his hands and said that when entering his house, you have to wear slippers. She asked in surprise, why? He replied, it's forbidden to wear shoes in the house. She picked it up and asked, are slippers part of the capital's culture? He did not agree and said, it's his invention. She asked, what? And she thought, Kureto is a little weird. The protagonist looked at her and thought, her childish spontaneity can hurt without a knife. However, he is not going to betray his principles. In the capital, there are maids who always clean, and the streets are paved with stones, so shoes do not get dirty too much. In Howin village, the environment is different. Wild roads mixed with mud and grass. Plus, a little Japanese culture does not hurt. That's why he left a place for taking off shoes. But for them, it looks weird. She put on her slippers and shouted, "Great, these shoes are so light." He folded his arms over his chest and answered, "Exactly." She continued, "They are comfortable and do not dirty the floor." "He is so smart, Kurito. She likes them. She will wear them at home too." He agreed and said that they will make a village fashion out of it. She laughed and said, "Okay." Then they went on. She saw the living room and said that it has become bigger. He smiled and replied that the size hadn't changed. He removed the wall where the fireplace used to be and connected it to the kitchen. She understood, so that's what it was. But the room seemed more spacious. The protagonist pointed his finger towards the kitchen and said that he couldn't stand cramped kitchens and that it was easier to move around this way. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he could cook. The protagonist agreed and said, "More or less." He thought that he had lived alone for a long time. Nina screamed in surprise. She didn't know that men could cook. He asked, "Really?" She answered, "That's right. I've never seen Dad cook, he only drinks." MC laughed and exclaimed, "He couldn't imagine Andre cooking either." He sneezed. She asked if he had a cold. Then Nina said loudly, "Not only Dad but also other men in the village." He thought, it seems that men in this world only work or do housework, although there still have to be cooks? Well then it's understandable why she was so surprised. MC explained, "But he's far from Stella, so if there's a chance, they'll cook together." Nina clenched her fists and asked in surprise, "Is he sure?" He agreed and said, "They'll cook together, eat together, there's enough space here. Even when he is not in the village, they can use the kitchen, for the sake of the atmosphere of family idyll. He wants to do something that unites people in this world." He thought that such a house shouldn't be idle. Nina looked at him, closed her eyes, and said that she felt that from now on, life would become even more fun. She could hardly cook something together and go to the mountains for bugs and play in the river and go look at flowers. There are still many things she wants to do with Kurito. She's so glad that he moved here to live. Now every day will be fun. She extended her hand to him and said loudly, "Nice to meet you, neighbor." He extended his hand in response and said, "Nice to meet you too, Nina." Suddenly, she screamed that she urgently needed to go home and ran towards the exit. He asked, "Housework?" She agreed and said that she helps her mother on the farm. She takes care of the leeks and such. He was surprised and said, "Great." She continued that she wanted to walk around the Kurito house some more. The protagonist replied, "They are neighbors now, so she can come visit anytime." Nina stood by the door, waved her hand at him and shouted, "Yeah, that's right. She will give him some onions when they are ripe. They will see each other again." He stood by the stairs, arms folded across his chest, and said, "See you soon." Oh, these children, quick as the wind. Then he thought, farm? Since he now lives in the countryside, he might as well grow vegetables. A garden wouldn't hurt him. He could try cherry tomatoes for beginners. MC entered the room and said, "He'll have to consult with Stella." Then he looked around and added, "Well, he has enough other troubles now. First, he needs to fill this oppressive emptiness. What a stuffiness." The protagonist came up, opened the window and said, "First he needs to air out the room." He looked out the open window, looked into the distance and quietly said, "Here it is, life on two bases." Then he snapped his finger and loudly added, "Okay, time to get started." After a while, Andre knocked on his door and shouted, "Hello, Kurito." He just got back from work and decided to help him move. The protagonist opened the door and thanked him for the offer, but he had finished everything a few minutes ago. Andre raised his hand, was surprised and asked, "What? So fast?" He noted, "Well, his magic allows you to carry luggage and arrange it easily." Andre replied, "I see, he really doesn't need help?" The protagonist apologized for having to go for nothing and asked if he wanted some tea. Andre suggested that maybe they could celebrate the housewarming party then. Stella stopped him, saying that he had a lot of chores. But if everything was already over, then why not? Kurito answered that it sounded good. Andre added, "Well, in that case he would ask Stella to bring some food." The protagonist replied that if it was not too much trouble, he was tired and did not have the energy to cook anything, and if so, they could use his kitchen. Andre clarified, "Is that so? Okay, and we will also see his new house." He walked towards the house, then turned around, waved his hand and shouted, "He is quick. Just call Stella and Nina." The protagonist stood by the gate and thought, Andre is so cheerful even after work. He runs like Nina. He could use their energy. He said in response, and in the meantime, he will prepare some drinks. After a while, they approached the house and Nina waved her arms and shouted, "Here they are." Stella wished him good evening and asked, "Is it okay that they bother him on the first day of moving?" He answered that everything is fine, the house is already ready. She smiled and said, "Well then." They went into the house, then Nina stretched out her hand forward and shouted, "Stop." The two of them, wearing shoes in the Kurito house is prohibited. Then she turned to the main character and said, "Is she right, Kurito?" The parents stood there in bewilderment, and the main character laughed. Nina pointed to the slippers and loudly told them to take off their shoes and put on these slippers. They asked in surprise, "Slippers?" The main character agreed and asked them to do as Nina said. The parents put on the slippers, and Andre noticed they are quite comfortable. Stella added how light they are, they should buy the same. Slippers are really gaining popularity. Then they went to the hall, looked around in surprise. Nina raised her hands, opened her mouth and screamed, "What an amazing house!" The protagonist noticed she had been here before. Andre exclaimed, "How nice! Kurito has a sense of style." The protagonist thought, well, in his past life, he never put houseplants in his house. They went into the kitchen. Stella covered her face with her hands. The protagonist asked in fear, "What is it, Stella? Is she sick?" She took her hands away and screamed, "Amazing!" Everyone looked at her in surprise. Stella went to the table, pressed her hands to her chest, and asked in surprise, "Isn't this the newest kitchen with magic tools that are so popular in the capital?" She continued to be surprised. She saw something so good for the first time. "Oh my god, water flows with the help of magic?" He agreed and added, "I have never seen Stella so excited." Nina turned to her father and asked, "Why doesn't he buy her the same one?" Andre answered, "It must be expensive." Then Stella turned to everyone and apologized. The protagonist said that everything was fine and suggested that she come and use it whenever she wanted. He couldn't handle it all anyway. She raised her hands and asked, "What? Was he sure?" Andre looked at them and said to his daughter, "Okay, Nina, let's go explore the Kurito house." Nina raised her hands up and shouted, "Hooray, let's go." Then Stella turned to them and loudly clarified, actually they were guests, so that they wouldn't do anything thoughtless. Then she turned to the protagonist, apologized for being so noisy. He replied that they were fun to be with, and he didn't mind. He wanted to show them his house anyway. The protagonist asked, would they then do some cooking? She agreed, put the basket down and said, although she had already cooked something at home, she would get it out now. They opened the basket, he looked inside and said, it looked delicious. She specified that there was milk soup with potatoes in the pot, and also roast venison. She hoped that was his taste. He shouted that he liked it, so she shouldn't worry. She calmed down and said, thank goodness. It seemed that there were 4 seasons here too, and it was early summer, to be honest. He was really happy to try the seasonal dish of this world. The protagonist asked what she wanted to make from the rest of the ingredients. She answered, stewed meat and vegetables with agio mushroom sauce, and also a salad. He suggested that if that was all, he could help. She thanked him. Stella looked at him, smiled, and added that they should start before the two got hungry. He smiled back and said, sure. Afterwards, they put on their headscarves. He began to cut carrots. She watched him and said, just like Nina said, it looks like he really can cook. He felt embarrassed and said a little, well, he had lived alone for a long time and thought he was just cutting carrots. She continued, and still, it was great that he could cook for himself. He felt embarrassed and thought that he felt a little awkward. Stella picked up the frying pan and said, there was no help there. The protagonist said if Andre were asked, he would probably help. She asked, does he think so? He stood next to her and thought, after all, he loves his family, and answered, that's true. At that time, Andre looked into the kitchen. The protagonist turned around and screamed in fear. Andre said, Kurito, he'll take over for him so he can rest. Then the protagonist and Nina watched them, and he asked, what's wrong with him? Nina answered, well, it seems like Dad was upset when she said that he gets along with Mom. He turned to her and said, I see, so he's jealous, it's getting hot. He took off his headscarf and suddenly they heard Andre scream, hot. Stella asked, is he okay? The protagonist and Nina looked out from behind the closet and saw Stella holding Andre's finger with a towel. He said that he got burned. She smiled and asked, did he think that everything would work out the first time? At this time, the protagonist looked at Nina and said, no matter how you look at it, these two are a great couple. She smiled and said, exactly, and added that if she ever got married, she would like them to be as close as Mom and Dad. The protagonist looked at her in surprise and thought, do children her age already think about such things? Although probably, girls think about it earlier. At this time, Stella told Nina to help her set out the plates. Nina ran to her and said, right now, then turned to the protagonist and asked, will he help her? He agreed. Later, they sat down at the table and Andre said, well, let's celebrate Kurito's housewarming. Nina picked up a fork and happily shouted that she wanted to try her father's first dish. The protagonist said that he would not refuse either. Andre wished everyone a bon appetit. The protagonist tried it and said, Andre, it's burnt and undercooked. Andre shouted back, no way. Stella added, the vegetables are hard. He was surprised, seriously? Stella sat with her eyes closed, put her finger to her chin and said, we need to practice together so that next time he can do it. Andre agreed. For the sake of his beloved family, Andre will do everything in his power. After some time, the protagonist opened his eyes, waking up from the rays of the sun falling on him. He sat up in bed and scratched behind his ear, asked, "What? Oh yeah, he lives in the village now." After that, he put the kettle on the fire and made himself a hot drink. He went out onto the balcony, looked ahead, he took a sip of his drink, and thought that luxury is tiring. It is quieter here than in the capital, and he is not nagged for drinking tea incorrectly. A place where he can live in complete freedom, his bastion. Have breakfast anywhere, drink tea anywhere, be a little lazy slob. That is the whole charm of living in two places. After that, he left the dirty dishes in the sink and going out into the yard, thought that here he can completely relax. He stretched the joints of his hands, and at that moment, Nina ran up to him, waving her hand. She called him and wished him good morning. He reciprocated and noticed that she got up early today. She asked what he was doing. He replied that he was just doing exercises to help him relax. She was surprised, right? Then she raised her hands, running closer to him, and said that she didn't know why she needed it, but she would try it too. He looked at her with a smile, and then replied, "Okay, then she should repeat after him." She agreed. After that, they started doing the movement to the count. Nina, spreading her arms out to the sides, laughed loudly and said, "What strange movements." The protagonist looked at her and thought, "Really? This is probably how it should look for a person from another world." He told her not to underestimate such things. After these exercises, her body will become better. She agreed. It was really interesting. Then MC noticed that the warm-up was dragging on. He said that they were done. She asked, "What? Already?" She liked it. At that moment, Stella came up to them and wished him a good morning. He reciprocated, and she apologized for Nina bothering him since early morning. He replied that it was okay, but it was more fun together. She said that she was glad that they were getting along so well. She then looked at Nina and said that she seemed to have become more cheerful since Kureto moved here. She happily agreed. "That's right." The protagonist thought how cute. Stella told her daughter not to get too carried away. The men needed to work in the fields. She replied that she knew, and then they headed towards the exit, and she waved at the protagonist and said that they would see each other later. He waved back and agreed, saying, "See you later." Then he looked down and thought, who was entertaining whom here? Then he clenched his fists and thought, that's not it. He was supposed to enjoy his free time. It was time to relax. He was definitely not alone. After that, he placed a stool in the shade of a tree and looked ahead, thinking it would be nice to cool off in the shade. Maybe he should grill some sausages like Andre suggested, but drinking alcohol right after breakfast. After that, he looked at the treetops and said, exactly. After a while, he placed the hammock between two trees and said with a smile, that's what you need. He thought that he sometimes already had some fabrics and rope in the company of Emilio and made the hammock himself when he had some free time. Although Emilio was skeptical, he was a little worried because it was handmade. It was generally quite pleasant. After that, he climbed inside and froze in surprise. He closed his eyes and thought that he was as if in zero gravity. What? Isn't the result too good for the first time? He was proud of himself. Maybe he was a genius? In the past world, he could not even dream of such a calm life. Several birds flew over him. Rays of light fell on the space around him. After a while, Nina, smiling, called him and asked what was this. He was surprised that she was already here. Doesn't she need to work in the field? She answered, she does, but she was curious about what he was doing. He apologized for distracting her. At that moment, Stella came up to them, apologized back, but she couldn't calm her down. He said, I see. Then he thought, damn, kids love things like this. Nina is quite a curious child, so when she saw something new, she couldn't resist. She put her hands on the hammock and said that she wanted to try it too. Could she? The protagonist said, sure. He would hold it so she could lie down. She happily said, hooray! Stella started apologizing again. Let her calm down a bit so they could get back to work. Nina was swinging on the hammock, her hands raised. She happily shouted, wow! This is so much fun. The protagonist grabbed the edge of the hammock and said that he would swing her. She laughed out loud, and then her mother asked, is she happy? Then they should go to work. In response, she said that she should try it too. Stella was surprised. What? She added, it's fun. Come on, it's so great. MC put his hand forward and said that she should try it. She thanked him, then hesitantly extended her hands towards the hammock, said okay, since they insist. She climbed inside and asked, is that it? Nina confirmed it and told her to close her eyes now. She followed the instruction, and then the protagonist asked, Stella, did you fall asleep? She jumped up and screamed, no. It is not time to relax. The work is not finished. The protagonist thought that she was clearly tired, and Nina, confused, asked what. She suggested calling it a game day. MC explained that it was actually a hammock. What kind of game day is this? She said that she wanted a hammock too. The next second, Stella shouted, enough! Plants are alive too, how are they? Nina said, oh well. Then she waved to the protagonist and said, see you soon, please. He should let them lie on this for a while. Stella thanked him. The protagonist waved and said, "Okay, bye." Plants are alive too. He thought that in the previous world he didn't do that much. It's not that easy to live a self-sufficient life. They live in the countryside, where there is a lot of greenery. It's probably best to do that here, but he doesn't really know much about it. A personal farm. With these thoughts, he imagined a vineyard in his backyard and, rising up on the hammock, shouted, "This is really great. Why not try it? If you're going to do something, you should do it seriously." Then he lay back down and thought that today doesn't count. After some time, Andre and his daughter came to him, and he said that he was told that he has a hammock. MC, looking at Andre riding on the hammock, thought that he should tell them how to do it. For a while, this thing became quite popular. After that, the protagonist headed to the vegetable garden. Andre asked, "What's the matter?" "Why is he looking at the vegetable garden?" He sighed, turned around and said that he wanted to plant something too. He replied that it was great. Okay, then he would help him. The protagonist was surprised. "What? Is he sure?" He replied, "Of course. It's good that he became interested in agriculture. By the way, does he have experience in this?" He awkwardly twiddled his fingers and replied that he was embarrassed to admit it, but he only grew one small thing. He replied, "I understand, but at least that's it." Then he thoughtfully added, "Then we should start with something simple." The protagonist asked, "Are there any crops that even a beginner can grow?" Andre thought about it, then said, "If he is going to disappear in the royal capital, then he needs something like this. Why do I have to take care of it every day?" He confirmed it, something like that. Ideally, something that would grow on its own if given the right care. He asked, "Something that didn't require any care? Maybe green onions or potatoes?" At that moment, Stella came up to them and greeted them. MC reciprocated, and Andre noticed that she was just in time. They needed to find something that even Corrado could handle. She asked, "Really? Their fields were nearby. Did he want to see them?" He said, "Of course." After some time, they approached the field, and the main character said in surprise, "Wow, what a beautiful field." Andre sighed and said, "Exactly." The protagonist, scared, asked, "But can he really handle this?" Stella said, "No problem. Green onions can even be grown at home, for example in a flower pot. Potatoes even grow on their own. Even busy Corrado can handle it." He asked, "Really? That's good. Now he feels like he can do it." She said, "That's great." Then Andre asked, "Hey, he picked some onions. Does he want to try them?" The protagonist smiled, turned around and said, "Sure." Then he looked at the size of the green onion in his hands and thought in surprise, "What?" Then he shouted, "Why so big?" Andre was surprised, "Really? But this size is considered normal." "No, this is really huge. 3 times bigger than he imagined. The size is comparable to the Tirea onion variety, specially bred in his home world. He will never grow one like that." Then he said, "Maybe in other regions it is about this size, but thinner?" He showed the small size with his hands, and Andre asked, did he imagine it? Maybe it was a weed? Stella added, "Too small." The protagonist shouted, "It is not a weed." He thought he was crazy. Then Andre broke the green onion into 2 pieces and said, "Oh well." He peeled it so he can try it. After that, he handed the plant to the protagonist. He took it in his hands and said, "Okay." He wished him a pleasant appetite, and after biting into a piece, noticed that it was sweet. Although it was so big, it tasted like a fruit. Andre smiled and said, "You can eat it boiled or baked, but he likes it raw the most. It is very useful in cooking as a seasoning or a side dish. Easy to grow, easy to cook." Then MC said, "It's decided. He will grow green onions." Andre noticed that he quickly agreed, and Stella added, "Since he was here, why not take a look at the potato?" The protagonist was surprised. "Potato? It sounds like a potato." He thought maybe it's different from what was in his home world. Stella explained that it tastes like a potato, but it's easier to eat. Delicious and filling, she advises to pay attention to this. It grows in the neighboring field. They need to take a look. Then they came to the right field, and the protagonist thought, "The potato fields are very beautiful." He is delighted. Stella said that she will now bring one to try. Andre raised his index finger and added that these are unpretentious vegetables. Even if you do not take care of them well, they will still grow. They need minimal care. The protagonist said, "Not that difficult." And he added, "To be honest, it's easier than growing onions." The protagonist said, "I understand." Then Stella handed him the root vegetable and said that this is the potato, longer and thinner than a regular potato. He agreed, "Really? Something between a potato and a sweet potato?" She added that potato can be eaten boiled. He could take it home and try to cook it. He was surprised, right? Then he thanked her. She added, "Everything else is a bit more complicated." Well, what does he think? He clenched his fists and said that he will try to grow green onions and potato. Andre, smiling, said that this was great. That's what they would do. Stella, smiling, added, then she would share the seeds and seedlings with him. He was surprised. What? Are they sure? Andre said that they had plenty of it, so he didn't have to worry. He should contact them if there were any problems. In response, the protagonist thanked them. and again they help him out. After a while he started planting and said, 3 meters wide and 4 meters long. Good, the dimensions are as Andre recommended, we can start. He thought he wasn't sure he could handle a big field, then maybe it could be expanded when he got used to it. He squeezed the muscle in his arm and smiled and said, first, we need to get rid of the weeds. He extended his hand forward and used slash. A few pulses of energy mowed the grass in front of him, and he said, easy as pie. He hadn't used it for a long time either. The divine essence that gave him the skills probably didn't expect him to use it to mow the grass. After that, he picked up the broom and thought, at least he saved time. The roots were still in the ground, but that could be removed when he dug. After that, he started digging and thought, maybe he should use distortion to dig up the soil. Then he sighed, extended his hand forward and thought, no, stop fooling around, this is too much. At this moment, Andre peeked out from behind the building and said that he brought him fertilizer, he should add it when he digs. Then, seeing the work process, he was surprised. So fast, he's already digging? The protagonist turned around, noticed, it's him, Andre, he shouted. Didn't he finish mowing too quickly? He replied that he was too lazy to clean it up manually, so he used a little magic. He replied, what a convenient magic. Can he show it? The protagonist said, sure, he hasn't seen it yet. Okay, he pointed his hand forward and used the slash again. Andre, confused, shouted, wow, what the hell was that? It looked cool. The protagonist said nothing, and Andre shouted for him to do it again. He agreed. He shouted, amazing. How does he do that? He replied, he slashes space. Smiling, he added, his magic is so interesting, you can watch it forever. The protagonist said that he was glad he liked it. And then he looked at the bags and asked, he said he brought fertilizer? He reached for the bag and thanked him, and Andre said that since he brought it, he could help him remove the weeds and, the protagonist was surprised. Where did these conditions come from? He was going to give the fertilizer for free. He answered, an equal exchange. He understands, fertilizer for a bed of 3 meters by 4 meters, this is the area he will work from, an equal exchange. Andre shouted at him to wait. This is too little. And he smiled and said that he was on his way. He will take care of everything, but someday he will have to mow his harvest too. Andre said that he was surprised by him, and then thanked him for his help. It is hard work. The protagonist said, he understands, he probably has a lot of work. He answered that this is not true. Stella works mainly. Love is blind, even if it is a joke. Negotiating with merchants is a real hassle. The protagonist smiled and said that everything was fine. He just hadn't met any real merchants yet. You can't relax with people like that. Then he thought, it can't be helped. Having found himself in another world, he ended up in this village and met this family. They constantly help him. He needs to do something to repay them for their kindness. He will definitely think of something, because they have accustomed him and accepted him as one of their own. After a while, the protagonist rubbed his eye and shouted, it's time to take a short break. He closed his eyes and thought that he was tired of mowing the grass near Andre's house all day, but he was satisfied with their dinner. Then he turned around, looked at the ground and said, well, great, this is already something like a vegetable garden. The protagonist put his hands on the shovel and thought, it's nice to do something other than his main job, although the lack of physical exercise makes itself felt. He will consider this a hobby. Then he heard a familiar voice ask, is he already doing vegetable gardening? That's great. The protagonist turned around and said, oh, it's them. They said hello. He then pointed at them and shouted, Mommy Taylor and Dad Greg. She covered her mouth and said, exactly. Dad Greg said, by the way, they didn't introduce themselves when they first met. Mommy Taylor added, a wandering adventurer wouldn't ask for the names of ordinary villagers. He apologized to them. Meanwhile, they said, her name is Angelica, his is Griff. The protagonist said that they hadn't seen each other for a long time and apologized for greeting his neighbors so late. Angelica said that it was fine. He had enough troubles with the move. Most likely, they should apologize for bothering him. He said, it's nothing, he's already settled in, so it's not a problem. At this time, Griff said it must be so, since he is gardening. Then she asked what he was growing. He said that he wanted to start with potatoes and onions. Then the Griff came up, sat down, looked at the bed, and said that it would be better to raise the bed with potatoes a little higher. The protagonist asked, is that true? The Griff turned to him and explained that the roots would grow. He shouted, I understand. Advice from an experienced gardener. He thanked him and said that he would do so. Then he said that they had something and handed the protagonist a set of plates. He asked, what is this? He answered, gratitude for the completed quest and a housewarming gift. He can use them if he wants. The protagonist took the bag, looked at it in surprise and said, what? Angelica handed him another bag and said, and she has homemade butter and cheese here. He took it in his hands and shouted that it smells amazing. Then he asked, isn't there too much of everything? And the plates are pretty good. Did Mr. Griff make them himself? He agreed, and Angelica added, the Griff family is in the business of making tableware. The protagonist said loudly, then I understand. Only a true master could make such beautiful plates. He thanked him and said that he would cherish them. He lowered his eyes and replied, "Nothing special." Angelica looked at him and asked, "Did someone seem embarrassed?" He replied that she imagined it. The protagonist looked at them and thought, at first glance, he looks unhappy. But he just doesn't know how to express his kindness. He asked, "Angelica, does she probably keep cows or sheep?" She agreed and said that he was right. They have a lot of sheep at home. All this is made from sheep's milk. He looked and asked, "Is that so?" Then he thought, a real shepherd. He smiled and said that he was thinking about raising livestock. She looked at him and said, "Then she advises sheep. They consistently bring wool and milk." The protagonist replied that it sounded good. She continued, "Or can they be used for meat?" He agreed and said, "And it's true." She told him to think about it. He agreed and added, "Perhaps." The protagonist thought, should he breed them for meat? At this time, Angelica and Griff headed for the exit. She turned around and said, "Okay, they won't interfere." Griff wished him luck. The protagonist stood at the door and shouted, "Good," and thanked them. Meanwhile, evening came. He went into the house, laid out the food given to him, looked and shouted, "It looks very appetizing." He tried it and said loudly, "The cheese and butter are so satisfying and delicious. The dishes are also good." Everyone here has their own role, not only Angelica and Griff. Andre hunts and guards the village, Stella and Nina grow various crops in the field. Everyone has their own skills, everyone acts as a single mechanism, and they do not need special magic for this. He thought, he does not have similar skills, and yet, can he also help with something? The next morning he went out into the yard, yawned and heard a familiar voice say, "Good morning, Kurito." He looked up and called out, "Chief Leroy." Leroy looked at him and said, "No need to be so formal." Then he apologized and said that he dropped by early in the morning. Has he settled in already? Are there any complaints? The protagonist said that there are no complaints. The air is clean, the food is delicious, and the people are kind. He likes everything. Leroy looked at him and doubted that he couldn't tell from his face. Did something happen? He smiled and said, "What made him think that?" He continued to tell him honestly. The protagonist closed his eyes and said, "Well, Angelica and Griff came to see him yesterday." Leroy clarified, "Oh yeah, I think he was doing a quest for them." He continued, "They gave him housewarming gifts. They are very useful gifts." He was so happy about it, but at the same time, he wondered if there was anything he could do to help Howin village, since he was living in two places to pay back the debt. He wouldn't be able to live here forever, and he wasn't as good at it as the locals. Although he had found a suitable place for himself, he felt like he was only receiving and not giving anything in return. Leroy said, of course, it was nice to hear that he wanted to help their village so much. However, he shouldn't rush into it. The protagonist looked at him in surprise and asked, what was he talking about? Leroy continued, they lived in the countryside. There were few people, no shops, and there was very little leisure time. Even their children were leaving here because they wanted to live in the big city, like Greg and Taylor. The protagonist thought, as far as he remembered, they both became adventurers in the capital. It was no surprise. Young people are always restless, but he personally preferred a quiet, comfortable life. Although is it fair at 27 to compare yourself with those who just left the parental nest? Leroy smiled and said, and yet Kurito is the first to move from the capital to the village. He raised his hand to his chest and asked, him, really? He said they are very happy about it, all of them. The protagonist asked, really? He agreed and added, otherwise Angelica and Griff wouldn't have come to him. He thought they were happy to see that for the first time in a long time, a young man had appeared here. He looked at him and thought, he wasn't that young. And Leroy continued, so that he wouldn't bother his head with all sorts of nonsense, just enjoy life. At that moment, he remembered his father's words, who told him to live the life he wanted to live. He closed his eyes, agreed and added, still, he was very happy that he now lives in this village. He thanked him. A little later, the protagonist was walking through the field and thinking, maybe he should listen to his advice and think more positively. He remembered Leroy's words, who told him to just try to find something to do that he liked. He stopped and thought that the village chief was right. There was no need to rush, otherwise he might make the wrong choice. Lost in thought, he didn't notice how he reached a large greenhouse, looked at it and asked in surprise, what is this? Then he went inside, looked and said loudly, I see. Tomatoes grow here. He hadn't seen any farmers growing tomatoes nearby, so he didn't expect to see them here. He said that he liked tomatoes, then asked if he should buy some. At that moment, he took a closer look at the tomatoes and said, in surprise, wait, these tomatoes have a bit of a strange shape. If you look closely, they are shaped like an onion, and they have such a beautiful color, they must be very juicy. At that moment, he heard someone shout, hey! He turned around and saw a shovel in front of him. The protagonist raised his hands up and asked, what? A young man was standing next to him with a shovel in his hands, pointed at him and said, he not to touch it without his permission. He shouted that he would put him in jail for stealing tomatoes. The young man moved the shovel towards him and told him to get out of here. A tomato thief. The protagonist asked, who? A tomato thief. The young man nervously asked, well, who else could he be? The protagonist answered it was a misunderstanding, then apologized and said, he just noticed the tomatoes were an unusual shape. He shouldn't have entered here without permission. The young man looked at him and asked, then who was he? He was seeing him for the first time. Was he from this village? He agreed, and added that he had recently started living here too, and introduced himself as Coretto. The young man answered, that same weirdo who moved here from the capital? MC was surprised and asked, what, does he know him? The young man answered, of course, moving from the rich and comfortable royal capital to the depths of the world is pretty stupid. He would understand if he were an old wreck, but he was about his age. The protagonist thought, what a bad language, and said, just because the capital is rich, it does not mean that it is perfect. There are many people, buildings, and little nature. He likes this village. The young man looked at him and asked, seriously? Then added that he should listen. Even though he is from the capital, it is easy to talk to him. He does not seem cool. The protagonist closed his eyes, smiled, and answered, I see, then thought, did he praise or insult? The young man apologized for taking him for a thief and added, it is just that sometimes there really are idiots who take someone else's without asking. The protagonist looked at him in surprise and asked, are there such people here? He did not know. The young man answered, he is talking about strangers, non-locals. And yes, he suggested communication without formalities. He does not like it. Then he asked how old he is. He answered, 27. The young man turned and said in surprise, how old? And you cannot tell by him. The protagonist said that he had heard that before. The young man reasoned that he was only a year younger than Andre, but he was already an old man. The protagonist asked him not to say that in front of him, okay? MC reminded him that he still hadn't introduced himself. He said, oh yeah, his name is Elga. He grows tomatoes, 22 years old, the most handsome man in the village. He asked, is that so? After that, he thought, he didn't know that there was another man around his age here. Maybe it would be a little more fun with him, and said, that's great. He would like to make friends, but there aren't many young people here. He extended his hand to him and added, then they will be acquainted. The protagonist extended his hand in response and agreed. He noticed that his hand was dirty and grinned. Elga smiled and apologized, then asked if he had teased him well. He answered, it was funny. Elga apologized to him again. The protagonist thought, is he a joker then? But he thinks he can find a common language with this blockhead. In the meantime, he filled a bucket with water from the well, put his hands in it, and asked, by the way, what kind of tomatoes does he grow? Elga asked in surprise, what do you mean? Regular tomatoes? He doesn't understand what he's talking about. The protagonist shouted, no way. Aren't tomatoes more rounded? He asked in surprise, really? He only knows the tomatoes they grow themselves. He can go to the next village to sell them, but he doesn't go any further. The protagonist thought, well, that's understandable. There are no developed logistics for food in this world. Without a car, planes, they will spoil on the way. Besides, there are monsters wandering along the road. Elga is not a warrior, so he won't take any risks. Then he pointed at the tomatoes and asked if he can take one. Elga told him to wait, took a tomato out of the cart and said, these are already ripe. The protagonist lifted the tomato up, looked at it carefully, and thanked Elga. He answered, yeah. Then he looked at the tomato and thought, pretty hard, but looks ripe. The surface is so smooth that he can't stop stroking it. At this time, Elga called out to him and told him to eat faster. The protagonist smiled and said, okay. He took a bite and then screamed, they are sweeter and sourer than regular tomatoes. Elga looked at him and asked, so what? Is that bad? MC screamed, it's insanely delicious. Tastier than any other tomato he's ever tasted. Elga said, I see. Then he covered his face with his hat and continued, although he already guessed, he just thought it would be nice to know the opinion of a person from the capital. The protagonist thought, actually he was joking. But a person is always pleased when the results of hard work are praised. Although his words are partly true, they are not like regular tomatoes in shape. The juiciness of the taste is also different, and yet the sweetness and sourness are well balanced. Elga must have put his heart and soul into growing them, but he doesn't know their potential. It's beyond his comprehension. After all, his range of movement is limited. It's unfair. And he's not only talking about Elga's tomatoes, but also Andre's leeks, how upset he is for them. At this time, Elga looked at him and asked, what's wrong with him? The protagonist was squeezing the tomatoes, asked if this was normal. They were so delicious. He looked at him in surprise and asked if he didn't want more people to eat them. Elga replied, well, he was thinking about it. Then he shouted, that's it. He wants everyone to enjoy the tomatoes. Then he held his chin with his hand and thoughtfully said, is it really better to sell a special variety as a special brand rather than on the general market? Elga shouted for him to wait. He's starting to scare him. Even if he says so, it's still impossible. The protagonist began to reason, well, if they can sell them in a big city, then he won't have to rack his brains about what to do with them. He'll make money, people will eat his tomatoes, everyone will be happy. He replied that he would have done so a long time ago if it were all that easy. The village of Howin is located in the wilderness. It's an impossible dream. He disagreed and shouted, "It's not so." At that time, he put his hand on his chest and proudly said, he will be able to spread his tomatoes throughout the country. Elga pointed at him and asked discontentedly, what was he talking about? Was he out of his mind? He looked at him and shouted, of course. Because that's exactly what he was looking for, a reason to contribute. He added, it would be faster to show than to explain in words. Elga asked in surprise, what was he talking about? He called out to him, looked him in the eye carefully and continued, if he said that he had the ability to instantly move to the capital, would you want to go there? He was very surprised and asked, what? And so, in an instant, they were transported to the royal capital. At this time, Mrs. Gakushi was happily running along the street and singing, she finally had a day off. Then she thought, the guild had been so noisy since Kureto became famous as a carrier. When he left, she was bombarded with complaints from adventurers. Thanks to her restraint, they managed to maintain peace. Too much trouble for a mid-level employee. She did it, Kushi. Meanwhile, she walked over to the ice cream and thought, her well-deserved rest. It's time to forget about work. Kushi smiled, pointed at the ice cream and said, this is ice cream. At this moment, the protagonist and Elga appeared here. She screamed in fear, what the hell? And fell to the floor. MC turned around and asked in surprise, Miss Kushi, what is she doing here? She screamed nervously, is she the one asking? They scared the hell out of her. He apologized to her. Elga looked around in surprise and asked, is this not a dream? Then he turned to the front and asked, the real Zalara castle? Elga turned his gaze and saw them looking at each other and thought, so he can really move between the capital and the village? Kureto, who the hell is he? At that moment, she turned to Elga and asked, is he Kureto's friend? He looked at her and thought, a real beast woman? This is his first time seeing her. She smiled, folded her arms and introduced herself. Her name is Kushi, and she works at the guild. They are always looking for new adventures and invited him to stop by if he is interested. He thought, cute, and answered, okay. The protagonist watched this and thought, a normal business smile, then asked, did he remember about the tomatoes? Then he grabbed Elga by the shoulders and started pushing him towards the exit. Then looked at Kushi and said, he just demonstrated his magic to this guy. Elga looked at Kushi and shouted, hey Kureto, does he know this cute girl? She looked at him, smiled and said, Mr. Kureto, he can come too. They are always happy to see him in their guild. At this time, Elga shouted at him not to push him. The protagonist turned to her, smiled and shouted, okay, he will come sometime. They went outside and at that moment they were transported to the village. The protagonist let go of Elga and he almost fell. MC asked, well, are you convinced now? With his magic, you don't have to worry about the distance. Elga covered his face with his hand and told him to wait, to let him get his thoughts in order. Later he turned around and continued, it seemed like, okay, they can move to the capital, but where will he sell them? The protagonist explained, it's simple, he's an employee of a large trading company and has good connections with the bosses. Spatial magic allows you to store products without losing their freshness. A large batch will not spoil. He shouted, man, he's good. Then he thoughtfully said, if his tomatoes get to such a big city, will there be a demand for them? The protagonist looked at him in surprise and asked, what's the matter? He quickly turned modest. Was he really scared of the sight of the royal capital? Elga got angry and shouted, what? Even if he asks him to help sell tomatoes in the capital, what benefit will it give him? He looked at him and shouted, if it makes their village a little richer, then why not? The protagonist looked down and continued, he means that he loves this village and wants to be at least a little useful to it. He may be an outsider, but they accepted him here as one of their own. Even if it was an extra burden, he didn't want to give up until he tried. Then he raised his hand to his chest and said loudly, he would spread the vegetables of Hourin village, not only in the capital, but throughout the country, and asked him to trust him. Elga listened to everything, then grabbed the back of his head with his hand and said, stop tempting him. The protagonist got angry and shouted, tempt? Elga added, he's asking again, is he sure he can sell all this? He answered, of course, he wouldn't offer if he doubted it. Olga thought about what a quick answer and said, well, okay, they'll try, since he's so sure. Then he bent down, picked up his hat from the ground, put it on his head and added, he himself wants to see if there's a demand for his tomatoes in the royal capital. The protagonist was happy and shouted, Elga. He continued, besides, he needs money. The protagonist looked at him in surprise and asked, so he agreed only because of this? Elga answered, you can't earn much in the countryside. Farmers also need money. Does he know about it? He answered that he was right. Money is important. At this time, Elga extended his hand and said, okay, we agreed. He was counting on him. The protagonist shook his hand and told him to leave it to him. After some time, Nina went to the pump and began to fill a bucket with water. At this time, she saw the protagonist running towards them. She shouted, Kureto. He asked, Nina, are your parents here? She pointed her finger to the side and replied that they were in the garden. Then she shouted, "Dad! Mom! Corretto has come to them!" He walked up to them and apologized for distracting them from work. Andre turned to him and asked, "Nothing serious, but what happened? He needed advice on caring for the garden?" He disagreed and said he was here for another matter, then told him everything. Andre looked at him in surprise and asked, "What? He wants to sell the village's harvest in the capital?" At this time, they sat down on a bench. The protagonist agreed and said that it was true. Andre thought about it and said, "That's great, but is he sure it will sell? It's an ordinary harvest." The protagonist screamed, "Nothing of the sort. It's completely unusual. Especially that onion he ate the other day. Such thick and sweet green onions are nowhere to be found. There is nothing like it in the entire royal capital. It is so unique." He raised his hand and said, "He thinks he is exaggerating a little." He screamed back, "No way." Andre looked at him and said, "I see, he seems very passionate about this." He continued, perhaps too presumptuously talking about it as if he knows a lot, "But the harvest in this village is too good to let the surplus rot. He doesn't know how many potatoes there are, but their ease of cultivation will make the supply stable, and judging by their taste, it's quite possible that they will become a staple." Andre replied, "Well, they don't mind. If he really thinks so, then why not try selling them?" The protagonist was happy. That's exactly it. The village chief has already given his permission. Andre was surprised and added, he was prepared. MC remembered the village chief's words, so he found it, "A way to pay the village?" and answered, "Exactly." He continued, "Elga tomatoes will also come into play. The more vegetables, dairy products, meat and other things they can sell, the richer the village will be." Andre asked, "Have they met yet?" He answered, "Just now." Nina looked at him and asked, "Will he sell Elga tomatoes?" He agreed. She was happy and screamed, "Great! She loves his tomatoes." He leaned towards her and thought, although she has nothing to do with the negotiations, she adds coziness, then said, "He likes them too." At this time, Andre thoughtfully said, "He works for a trading company. Does he want to sell everything through them?" The protagonist raised his hand to his chest and agreed, then continued, "He works for the Amelia company. With their help, you can distribute products to the market and restaurants." Andre asked, "What? Heard that now it is the most influential company?" The protagonist agreed and asked, "So does he know?" He raised his hand to his chin and answered, "Not much. He just heard rumors from random traders, like, there is a company that is growing at an unusual speed. But if Corretto magic is involved in this, then everything falls into place." He modestly noted that his contribution is not that big. Then he scratched his chin with his hand and thought, did not think that anyone in the village heard of the company. Andre is a point of contact with the outside world. Andre said, "It is encouraging that such a serious organization will do this." The protagonist looked at him and asked, "And what does he think? Will he allow selling his harvest?" Andre answered, "Well, they rely on him. Besides, it would be good for their family budget." Stella said that, frankly, they have a surplus of crops every year. Andre added, "That's a shame." The protagonist thanked them for agreeing and asked if they had any other crops they were proud of. He replied that they couldn't boast of a variety, but he knew people who grew a lot of other useful things. Wouldn't he like to visit them? The protagonist replied, "Of course." He would be only too happy. Later, they went to other people for a tasting. After a while, he laid out a small variety of crops on his table, looked at them and said, "Quite a collection. That's enough." He thought, are they serious? All of this is so delicious that it's impossible to narrow down the choice. The food of Howin village is simply amazing. What a difficult choice, but there is no point in showing everything at once. First, he must convince Amelia to sell them, otherwise nothing will work. Afterwards, he went to bed and thought, Emilio, he should at least listen to him to the end. Even with his help, it was amazing that he managed to create the largest company in such a short time. If he did not see any benefit in it, he would not hesitate to express his opinion or refuse. Even though they were friends, that was the kind of person he was. Tomorrow's meeting would decide everything. The next day, early in the morning, he moved to the royal capital. He entered the house and shouted that he had returned. "Elsa!" She turned around and calmly said, "Welcome home, Mr. Corretto." He looked at her and said, and she quickly adapted. She replied that she couldn't serve as a head maid if she was always surprised. He thought, Elsa is like that, a super talented maid. Then he asked, "Did anything happen while he was gone?" She replied, "Nothing happened. Mr. Emilio didn't leave a message." He said, "I see, he has business with Emilio, so he's heading to the company. He hopes he's not busy." Elsa replied that he doesn't have to worry about it. He looked at her questioningly and heard a voice from the living room, Emilio saying, "Welcome back." The protagonist walked into the living room, saw Emilio sitting on the couch, and thought, how at home he is. Then he asked, "Why is he here? For work?" Emilio turned to him and said he just decided to stop by for a while on his way home. He snapped, as if he knew when he would be back. Then he thought, Elsa got used to it very quickly, but Emilio wasn't surprised at all by his appearance. Then Emilio asked if he liked living in Howin village. The protagonist agreed and said that he spent his time in a way that he could never do in the capital. It was relaxing. Emilio noticed how he perked up and asked, "Is he saying that it was relaxing there?" He waved his hand and said it was so hot lately, even though he didn't have the same withering body, but maybe he wanted to spend some time there, although it was better to go to the city in the summer. The protagonist looked at him and told him not to talk about him as an old man. He replied, of course, he was a sensitive old man. He liked to take a bath. The MC raised his hand and asked him to listen. He wanted to sell something in the capital. He said with interest, "He rarely brings anything. What does he want to sell?" He replied that he would show him now. Then he took out the food and put it on the table. They began to examine it. Emilio put his hand to his chin and asked what it was. He replied, "The crops grown in Howin village." The next minute, Emilio headed for the exit, waved his hand and said that he had to go. The protagonist grabbed him by the vest with his hands and shouted at him to wait. He had just laid them out. He could have at least listened to the end. He turned to him and said, "This is a normal crop, Corretto." He really grabbed it. He continued, "This is an excellent product." He disagreed and asked, "Did the villagers ask him to sell them?" He continued, "If so, then he refuses to do this. Even if he asks, it is not in the interests of the company." The protagonist replied, he did not bring them because someone asked. In fact, he showed them because he thought they would sell. He would never deceive either the villagers or him. And he said that he was right, and he apologized for that. He once again approached the crop, put his hands on the table and said, "You need to check everything in person. This is the basis of business. It is bad to interrupt a person until he has presented his product." Then he turned, extended his hand and told him to tell him about this crop. The protagonist shouted, "Emilio." He interrupted him and added, he said, "This is a business meeting," so he would not forget to provide arguments. The protagonist said, "Of course, I understand." Emilio looked closely, put his hand to his chin and said he really had not heard of such varieties. The protagonist looked at him in surprise and asked, "So he did not know about it either?" "It seems that the villagers consider them normal." Emilio asked, "Is this a common thing for them?" Then it is not surprising that he has not heard anything about it. The difference in the perception of normality can be very different. He would never have known about it if they considered it normal. He clarified that is why he wanted them to sell them themselves. Then he raised his hands up and noted, buying good goods at a low price and selling them at a high price. This is the essence of their business. Emilio looked at him closely and said, "What? How did he talk?" He agreed. They looked unusual, but the taste was the most important thing. Corretto said he was most confident in this. It was true, no matter what he said, the only thing that really mattered was the taste. But it was this aspect that was the most convincing. He carefully selected the food for tasting. If the first impression was good, then he would respond positively to the steel food. He handed him a container of vegetables and thought, first of all, let him try raw vegetables. Then he said, look, he's already specially cut them. He can eat them straight. The food doesn't spoil in his storage. Emilio took a vegetable to try and said, he really was prepared. Then he'll try the onion, eat it and scream, sweet. What is this? It melts in your mouth. The protagonist answered, that's right, there will be more. It will be even sweeter if you cook it over low heat until it softens, but you can also bake it and eat it with salt. It goes well with alcohol, he brought that too. He looked at it and said, he's prepared well, then he'll try it. Emilio picked up a tomato and joked, now he's a tomato sommelier. Corretto looked at it and thought, a typical merchant. Emilio bit into the tomato, closed his eyes in pleasure, ate it and exclaimed, it's sweet and delicious too, like some kind of fruit. The protagonist looked at it, smiled and thought, he knew he'd like it. Emilio began to examine the tomatoes, said, they're completely different from the watery and sour tomatoes that are sold in our area. Very rich and delicious taste. And at the same time, the balance between sweet and sour is perfect. He looked at it and thought, his comments won't grow to the level of a review, will they? Then he raised his hand and called Elsa, gave it to her and told her to make soup with these tomatoes. She said good. The protagonist thought, so he shouldn't get carried away. Emilio said, okay, Corretto, let them move on to the next tasting for now. The protagonist asked, did he really get carried away? Although he wanted to, at this time, the maids were standing near the door, looking through the keyhole. One asked, what's going on? The other answered, Mr. Emilio and Mr. Corretto are having fun. The hero asked, well, how does he like it, Emilio? Does he think this will sell? Emilio wiped his mouth with a handkerchief and said, first of all, he wants to apologize again for the rude words. He would not have brought who knows what. The harvest of Howin village is really of the highest quality. All this can be sold if you approach the matter wisely. The protagonist was happy, clenched his fists and said, it works. Emilio looked at him, agreed and answered, he brought him a good product. Then he raised his hand to his heart and said loudly, Emilio's company will sell the harvest of Howin village. He gives him his word. Then he added, First, they need to come up with a sales plan. It will be a lot of work, but he will help, right? The protagonist answered, of course. After some time, the protagonist moved to the village again. Andre stood with his eyes closed near the gate and said, there is nothing unusual today. Everything is calm, as always. At that moment, the protagonist appeared in front of him and shouted, "Hi, Andre." He extended his spear forward and shouted, "What the?" The protagonist raised his hands and said that it was him, Kirito. Andre answered, "Ah, it is him," so that he would not scare him like that. The protagonist apologized and said that he knew that today would be his shift. After thinking, he remembered how Elena reacted and moved some distance. It always works. Andre asked, by the way, he has not been seen in the village for a long time. Did something happen? MC clarified about this. He was in the capital to sell the harvest that they gave him. Andre came closer to him, looked at him and shouted, "And how did it go?" "You sold it?" The protagonist walked away a little, raised his hands up, and said to let him explain properly. He calmed down and said, "Of course." He continued, he understands that he is interested, but he would like everyone to gather in the central square. Andre answered, "Okay." He will ask Stella and Nin for help. After a while, everyone gathered in the central square. The protagonist saw a large number of people and thought he did not expect such a violent reaction. Many more people gathered than he thought. Did they bring their families with them? Are they so worried about the fate of the harvest? After he was preparing for his speech and thought, he was starting to get a little nervous, as if he was preparing for his first presentation in the company. At this time, he heard a voice from behind that called him. He turned around and asked in surprise, "Elga?" He came up to him, began to shake him and shouted, "How are his tomatoes in the capital?" so that he would tell faster. The protagonist tried to break free from his hands and said that he would tell as soon as he calmed down. Elga continued to scream, "Calm down? He can't sleep at night." Then a girl came up to them and shouted, "Brother, stop. He's disgracing them." Kirito turned around and asked in surprise, "Brother?" Elga calmed down, pointed his hand towards the girl and said, "Oh yeah, this is his sister Mira." She thanked him for helping her brother. The protagonist said he didn't know he had a sister. Elga replied, "She helps take care of the tomatoes." Kirito approached her and said, "Nice to meet you." She responded, in kind. Elga noticed, by the way, Mira is one of the few free girls in the village. Then he came closer to him and whispered in his ear, "What does he think of her?" "Like her." The protagonist looked at him and asked, "In what sense?" "What?" Then Mira shouted, "Brother, it's none of his business. Stop bothering people." Elga answered, "He was joking." Then she came up to him and started hitting him with her fists. The protagonist watched what was happening. At this time, Nina came up to him. MC asked, "What is it, Nina?" She answered, "It seems they're tired of waiting." He remembered this and exclaimed, "Okay, they need to get down to business." He went out to the residents and apologized for asking them all to gather, but he wanted to report the results of the trade. At this point, he thought about it. It was quite difficult to talk about it himself, but they trusted him, an almost stranger, with such an important matter. Besides, he did everything he could. He tuned in and continued. Their harvest could not be sold through the stores. The people were surprised, began to ask, "What, then?" He continued, "That's not all. It's not that it can't be sold, it's that it can't be sold to stores." Elga looked at him and asked what he meant. He replied that he would explain now. Then he began to recount his conversation with Emilio. He told him to listen. Did he know what products they sell? The protagonist agreed and said that he did. Mostly seafood and rare monster meat, various delicacies. At that moment, he raised his hand to his chin and concluded, "What? Wait, that's all? Too much fish, it seems to him." Emilio sat opposite the protagonist, folded his arms across his chest and said, "Right, they don't sell farm products because they can be bought anywhere. There is no port in the royal capital, so fish and shellfish that cannot be kept fresh, as well as rare products, are in high demand. On the contrary, there are plenty of farms selling ordinary meat. These food products are not enough for a starting trading company, and what is more important, the market is already formed. It is not profitable to fight for it under such conditions. Even if they launch them on the market as their brand, they will not sell well. The main thing for ordinary people is that it is cheap and tasty. That is why he does not work with vegetables." The protagonist thought that he guessed, but he also answered, "I see, this niche is occupied." Then he asked, "So nothing will come of it?" Emilio raised his hand to his chin and answered, "He only said that it is difficult, but did not say that it is impossible." The protagonist shouted, "Really?" He agreed and added, "And I must send this to the market. You can sell them wholesale to restaurants." The protagonist was surprised and asked again, "To restaurants?" He continued, "Not just to restaurants. To elite restaurants, which are visited by nobles and royalty. There is such an event at which all trading companies enter into contracts with restaurants. He already has such a contract, however, it is for seafood, but they can sell these vegetables there and extend the contract. Vegetables under the brand of Emilio's company. Now they have a name and they have earned trust. Taste, freshness, quality are also important. But with the magic of Coretto, nothing will happen to them. He shouted, then let's begin. Emilio continued, this is not enough. Coretto, other companies that are trusted and with which contracts are signed are also strong. They may have a wider market than most, but they are still nobodies when it comes to vegetables and other everyday goods. It is quite difficult to displace the usual suppliers, so even with restaurants it is not so simple. A bright advertising campaign is needed so that other companies do not even look. A demonstrative tasting would not hurt. The protagonist thought, in the capital, no one will be surprised by the size of vegetables. He must take this matter seriously. If he does not come up with something himself, it will be unfair. He sat on the couch, scratched his forehead with his hand and thought, some bright advertising move is needed. At this time, Elsa came up to him and asked if he wanted more tea. He turned to her, agreed, and thanked her. Then he looked at her carefully and shouted, exactly, but this could work. She looked at him in surprise. After some time, there were a lot of people in Emilia's company. The administrator said, respected representatives of restaurants, asked them to come in order. Arsha said that this was the end of the line and asked them to come here. The young man said how many people there were. Another asked, doesn't Emilia only sell fish products? He was told, not only, by the way, what kind of clothes are these? Another said that they could lose. The next person in line said that he was just curious. They are so cute. At this time, the main character was carrying a box of vegetables for tasting. Turned around, saw Emilio, who said, it turned out to be an excellent advertising move. Does he think that they will succeed? MC said, Emilio. He folded his arms and added, I must admit, he was surprised. He didn't expect Coretto to come up with something like that. He smiled back and said, he didn't do that much. He should have thanked the girls for their help. He said a little earlier, since we were talking about such a flashy advertisement, why don't they ask Elsa and the others to advertise vegetables? He sat on the couch, crossed his arms and asked, how do they like that idea? Emilio looked at him in surprise. At that moment, Elsa passed by, heard the conversation and asked, what, are they going to do that? He pointed his hand forward, apologized and shouted, he shouldn't have said that. Forget it. Then he grabbed his head and said, that's borderline harassment, which is not very good for future brides. He's not a scumbag. Emilio asked, is that so bad? He raised his hand to his chin, thought about it and said, and yet. The protagonist answered, I see. Then it dawned on Emilio. He spread his arms out to the sides and said happily, what an unusual idea. He thought he was no longer capable of coming up with anything new. The protagonist replied that he was in his prime. Emilio continued, besides, this offer is not so bad. Most chefs are men. If they are served by beautiful girls, they will not refuse. The protagonist asked, seriously? Is he sure? Is it worth doing this for contracts with expensive restaurants? Isn't it bad manners? He replied, nobles and the royal family do not go to such events. This is their environment. Restaurants and companies are desperate to get better ingredients and more profitable contracts. In fact, there is a hunt under the guise of a banquet, a real battle. The protagonist looked at him and asked, even so? He continued, in that case, perhaps this will not be enough. The protagonist thoughtfully said, yeah, well, then how about dressing up in the traditional clothes of his homeland and serving customers like that? He asked again, his homeland? The one far to the east? The protagonist agreed and added, it's not often seen in the capital. He thinks it will attract attention. For some reason, he can't teleport to his hometown, so it will be difficult to get it, but he has a rough idea of what the clothes look like and can probably make them in a similar style. Emilio smiled and said loudly, interesting. I'll have to try it. He looked at him and thought, Emilio is very useful in situations like this because he never asks for details, and thanked him. Then Emilio turned to the maid and said, well, all that's left is to ask Elsa and the others, right? It dawned on the protagonist, right, they haven't even received permission yet. Elsa looked at them and instantly replied, okay. Then she asked, isn't it just necessary to change clothes and serve the company's customers? It's no different from their usual duties, so they shouldn't worry about it. The protagonist raised his hands up and asked, is she sure? She is from a noble family. She replied that it was fine. From what they said, they could help Emilio's company that way. He said, really? Still, it was somehow. She added, besides, Mr. Coretto rarely asks them for anything. Of course, they are willing to help in difficult situations. She would be happy if he relied on them more. They looked at each other, but at that moment, Emilio said, Elsa, but she can't decide for everyone? She asked, what? At that moment, the door to the office opened, and Lulua Mistalt asked, what does the traditional clothing in Mr. Coretto's homeland look like? Larasha El Fiore added, anything unusual? Arche clenched her fists and shouted in delight, how cute. Elsa turned to the maids and said, it seems they agree. Emilio concluded with a satisfied voice, so the decision has been made. At this point, the main character said that he had come up with something else. It would add some variety to the dishes they were serving. Meanwhile, in the hall, one of the restaurant representatives tried the onion and said that it was unusual. He had never seen one so big and sweet. The woman tried the tomatoes and, smiling, said that they were so fresh and so delicious that you could eat them just like that. The man shouted, "Bravo," and asked for more. Emilio said that his plan to bring them for the tasting had worked out great. The protagonist agreed and added, "Once they try it, they will understand the charm of country vegetables." Then Emilio folded his hands and added, "It remains to be seen how his secret plan is realized." The protagonist clutched his heart and said, "Oh," so that he does not press it. At that moment, Elsa appeared and called, "Mr. Carreto, Mr. Emilio," and apologized for keeping them waiting. The protagonist replied, "Nothing." She added, "Samples are ready and will be distributed to restaurant representatives." He thanked her. A little earlier, in the hall, Mr. Chamontar turned and asked, "What is that delicious smell?" Elsa approached him and said if he wants, he can try these vegetable dishes. He looked at her and thanked her, looked closely and asked, "What is it? Never seen anything like this. Pot au feu? No, something else. How interesting." She replied, "It is a traditional dish from one of the countries in the east, a stew of potatoes and pork with leeks and tomatoes. All their dishes are made from vegetables that are sold in Emilio's company." He said that he had never heard of it before. Then Chamontar tried it and shouted, "How delicious it was. Similar to the first dish, the texture is soft, the taste is delicate, the sweetness of the vegetables and tomatoes is pronounced. This recipe will appeal to the ladies. The vegetables are very tasty. He would like to talk about the recipe and a long-term contract." At this time, Emilio approached them and thanked him for his interest. Then he introduced himself. He was the director of the company and would explain the details to him. Other representatives heard the conversation, and one asked, "Isn't this a big shot?" Another agreed and said, "That same Mr. Chamontar." A man standing nearby asked, "The owner of a 5-star restaurant?" Someone from the crowd answered, "He is one of the best chefs. Rumor had it that he does not sign long-term contracts with anyone. Are these products really that good?" Then the maids came up to them, apologized, and Archilandora asked if they wanted to try it. Larasha Elfior added, "They still have a lot of them." After a while, the protagonist stood in the hall and watched what was happening. Elsa came up to him and said, "Amazing. All the restaurants are eager to sign a contract with Emilio's company. It turned out even better than they expected." The dish he suggested decided everything. He folded his hands, closed his eyes and said, "Yes, where he comes from, they really love home cooking, but he is glad that it suited the taste of the famous chef. Meat with potatoes." Elsa said, "The chef asked for the recipe." Then she clarified, "It is not on the menu, is it?" He replied, "Well, he changed a lot, used vegetables from the village of Howin. You can say that now it is a completely different dish." And he began to tell the recipe. The usual meat with potatoes. Instead of potatoes, he used potatoes. Instead of the usual onion, leeks, it turned out to be meat and potatoes from the village of Howin. Then he thought, "Lucky that there is a sauce similar to soy sauce here." Then he said, "Making a sauce similar to soy sauce was quite difficult." He concluded, he remembered everything he could. Then he added, "Their stew always had tomatoes." Later he learned that they usually do not put them, but it tastes better with tomatoes. She asked, "The taste of nostalgia?" He answered that it was. His mother cooked for him when she was alive. He did not like tomatoes, but she showed ingenuity. Then he thanked her for helping him recreate that taste, and for all the dishes she cooked. She replied that she could not have done it alone. It was all thanks to him, but she was glad that she could help. He watched Emilio and Chamontar shake hands and thought he couldn't have done it alone. And anyway, when the culture of his homeland leads to this, he feels that his appearance in this world has meaning. You can't forget anything. Yes, there are bad memories in the past, but at the same time he has a lot of good experiences. So he thinks that his task is accomplished. He was able to repay the villagers for their kindness. They will certainly be very happy. The protagonist finished his story with the words, "Just like that, that's how it all came to this point. That means," he raised his hand, pointed his index finger up, smiled and said loudly, "All their harvest will now be regularly purchased by one of the luxury restaurants of the capital." The people were very surprised and happy. Elga came up to him, grabbed him by the shoulders and asked, "Is he kidding?" He raised his hands and shouted that he was not joking. "It's true." One of the villagers asked, "Their harvest? For the capital? And to a luxury restaurant too?" He smiled and replied, "Yeah, he told them they would definitely sell." At that moment, Elga clenched his fists and shouted, "Hooray!" The residents were very happy. One of them said, "I would never have thought that their vegetables were actually so valuable." Another added, "It's nice that they can be sold for a lot of money." The protagonist was about to leave, but Elga stopped him, said, "But for him to wait, something doesn't add up here. If they cost so much in the capital," then he clenched his fists, got really angry and shouted, "Those traveling merchants knew all this and were deliberately buying cheaper. Well, of course, he's a real businessman too." At that moment Andre said, "Brother? Well, the fact that he even paid attention to them." Elga looked at him and said, "Andre," he continued, This can already be considered a big success, right? He agreed and said, perhaps. Andre continued, and besides, even if they have high-quality vegetables, they still won't sell for much in the village, and delivering them to the capital while still being fresh is just a dream. Mira said, it almost sounds like a fairy tale. Elga continued, well, that's true, but it's not just that. Andre added, thanks to this, they realized how valuable their products really are. Then he turned to the protagonist, lowered his head in front of him, and thanked him for everything. The protagonist raised his hands and shouted, no need. Then asked him to raise his head and added, he just thought that it could be sold well, and went to offer it and nothing more. Then Nina shouted, Coretto, it's not like that. Then she took his hand and happily shouted for him to look. She saw for the first time that everyone in the village was so happy. MC looked and saw the villagers smiling and happily talking to each other. At that moment, the village elder Leroy came up to them, called him and told him to let him thank him on behalf of the entire village. He continued, thanks to him, Coretto, the village lived. And most importantly, the farmers had hope again. At that time, people also began to thank him and praise him. They said, young, but what a fine fellow. He scratched his temple and said shyly, well, when there is so much gratitude, it's even a little awkward. Elga noticed, if they give gratitude, so that he takes it. The protagonist said, it should be the other way around. He didn't live here permanently, like them, but he was glad that he could at least help somehow. Andre shouted, what? Is he serious? The protagonist agreed. Andre said that he shouldn't think about it. Yes, they are grateful to him for everything he did, but there is no need to complicate things so much, so that he can just live here for his own pleasure, drink with them sometimes, and everything will be fine. He is too good a person, the protagonist called Andre. Meanwhile, Stella raised her hands to her chest and said that Andre was right. He played with the kids all the time, so he wouldn't worry so much about the contribution. Nina walked up to Stella and shouted happily, Coretto is fun. At that moment, Leroy came up and said, well, he said that being useful is great, but you shouldn't be obsessed with it, so that he can just live freely and for his own pleasure. The protagonist's eyes welled up with tears from what he said, and he began to remember, ever since he came to this village, the days when in his past life it was so hard for him that he couldn't even sleep. He carried all of this inside himself, a feeling of loneliness that wouldn't let go. Now he stopped looking back and instead began to remember the good moments. He wiped his tears with his hand, turned to the villagers and thought, all of this was only possible thanks to the people of this village. Because he met them, everyone spoke so well of him, and he was glad that he was able to repay them with kindness. Elga came up to him, put his hand on his shoulder, and asked how he was. Is he okay? Was he really crying? The protagonist replied that he was no longer crying, he smiled and continued that he was once again convinced that the village of Howin was simply wonderful. He no longer felt lonely. Andre was resurrected. What a day. Okay, today they will have a celebration. The villagers supported and shouted that this was a great idea. One of the villagers shouted, let everyone bring something. Another said that he just happened to have a bottle of special wine at home. MC suggested that they all come to him. He had enough room for everyone. One of the villagers concluded, now this is a real capital city merchant. Later, they celebrated at the protagonist's house. Leroy held a glass in his hand, stood up and said, well, in honor of the success of the harvest of the village of Howin, they shouted that they will drink. For them, the men drank, the women fussed around in the kitchen, and at the same time helped with the cleaning. The main character wiped the table, exhaled, sat down on the sofa, and said that it was good that they helped him with the cleaning. Everything immediately became clean. And yet, he remembered and thought, the men, although very drunk, but as soon as they heard the voices of their wives, sobered up abruptly and ran home. This is the real power of married life. He is impressed. Then he smiled and remembered. Andre couldn't be woken up and had to be teleported home. Stella, as always, kind. For the first time since childhood, he invited people to his home. He said that it was fun. He looked out the window and said that he would go for a walk a little, breathe fresh air. He went outside, looked at the sky and said that today the sky is especially clear. Then he sat down on the step at the entrance and added that he was glad that he started all this, life in 2 houses, and began to remember, of course, staying to work in Emilia in the capital. This would also be a good choice. But now he feels such satisfaction that he would not have received from this. Now he undoubtedly feels truly happy. Honestly, work and human relationships in life are difficult to separate. In his past life, he justified everything by being busy and working and did not take steps towards his future. Because of this, he lost a lot, and his life became empty. That is why in this life he tries not to give up on anything and tries to build his own happiness. The main character sat and looked into the distance and felt completely at peace. Then he decided that he would continue to live between the capital and the village and continue his lifestyle with 2 houses. Some time passed and one day Andre invited the main character to go fishing. Later, they moved to the river. and the main character looked at how it splashed in the river, spread his arms in different directions and shouted, "There are just a lot of fish." He leaned over to the water and said, "This is an amazing mountain river." Andre replied, "Yeah. Thanks to the current, it is cool here even in the summer." MC said, "A great place for a summer camp." Andre spoke his mind. "Right, and now, thanks to him, Curetto, you can calmly come here whenever you want." He turned to him and asked, "Has he really relaxed?" "Okay then." Andre added, "Well, it's not that bad. Summer will only get hotter, which means there will be more delicious fish." He will also show him cool places and teach him how to fish. The protagonist was delighted and exclaimed, "Seriously?" He folded his arms and replied, "Well, today they just came to reconnoiter. They should also help in the fields, otherwise Stella will definitely get angry." He replied, "Really? He also has to go to the capital during the day." Then Andre pulled himself up and said, "Okay, and now a little pleasure before work, Curetto." Then he turned to him and asked, "Did he bring that very thing?" He replied, "Of course. A magical device that makes it easy to light a fire, a set for easy cooking." The protagonist took out a bowl and said, he had already cut the vegetables this morning. Andre looked and exclaimed, "Pumpkin and lotus, super. And he has sausages and eggs, the eggs were just collected." The protagonist thanked him. Andre added, "And he also took the sheep butter and bread that Angelica had given him yesterday." The protagonist pointed his fingers in his direction and shouted, "Come on, wow! This will be incredibly delicious. He's a genius." Andre said contentedly, "Of course." In the meantime, they made a fire and put a pot in it. Then he asked, "Maybe we should fry the bread at the same time?" The protagonist noted that if the butter drips, the bread will become wet. It would be better to fry it separately. Andre answered, "I understand, expert in cooking." Then they looked into the pot, and the protagonist shouted, "It smells great." Andre added, "I want a drink right in the morning," and went to get his bag. The protagonist turned to him and asked, "Maybe wormwood tea would be better?" He answered, "Well, that's also an option. It's probably already cold." When everything was ready, they set the table, put the food on it, and began to eat. The protagonist bit off a sandwich, closed his eyes and said, "Breakfast in the countryside is just something." Andre added, "Here in the mountains, the air is so light and cool, a real pleasure." The protagonist agreed and said, "Exactly." Then he saw a fish splashing in the water and shouted. The fish jumped out. Suddenly he said that he did not want to work. Andre was surprised and asked, "What happened? Did something happen at work?" MC answered, "Not at all, everything is fine." Now he has a flexible schedule, the work is cool, and the salary is fine. He does not complain. He closed his eyes, folded his hands, and continued, "It's just that when everything is so comfortable, it's somehow lazy to get up and do something, he knows? He just wants to stay sitting here forever." Andre said, "Well, yeah, he understands. By the way, since the harvest came in, they have noticeably more work in the field." He asked fearfully, "Is everything okay? Has it become too hard?" Andre answered, "Yeah, it's not that scary. As long as he feeds his family, such employment is even enjoyable, and he gets used to it quickly. But that's why you need to clearly separate work and such moments of rest to enjoy each." The protagonist noticed, right on target, really. A little later, Andre said, "Well, we've eaten, time to slowly return." MC agreed. At that very moment, they found themselves in the village. He said that he delivered without incident. Andre thanked him, apologized for bothering him. Curetto replied, "What about him? He himself was having fun," and thanked him for breakfast. Andre suggested that they should get together some other time, then added, "Well now, forward, to field work." The protagonist stayed and said that he should say hello to Stella and Nina. He shouted, of course. Then he asked, "Is he now going to the capital, right?" The protagonist thought about how much he hadn't heard. It still seemed somehow unusual and replied, "Yeah, as they say, he who doesn't work, doesn't eat." Andre headed to the field, turned around, and wished him luck. He thanked him and said that he was going. Some time had passed since he was reborn in this world. Summer had come into full force. He had already completely gotten used to life between the village and the capital. Two seemingly incompatible worlds were connected by spatial magic. Now everything was going like clockwork. Both Howin village and Emilio's trademark were bringing in excellent profits. Both places had become a little more hectic, of course, but there was a real upswing. In general, everything was going as well as possible. At the same moment, he was transported and found himself in the company building. The protagonist saw Emilio sitting at the table and wished him good morning. He did not react at all. At the same moment, he shouted loudly, "Emilio!" He turned around and shouted back, "Oh, hello. Good morning, Curetto." He was early as always. Then the protagonist asked, "Is he okay?" He asked, "What is it?" He answered, "Well, he just works hard without a break. That's what he thought." Emilio replied, "Oh yes, he became kind. He was really touched." Then he smiled and asked, "Then would he refuse, or would he fulfill one request?" The protagonist replied, "It depends on the content." Emilio threw it sarcastically. Curetto became cautious. Before, whenever he asked, he immediately agreed. He got angry and shouted, "Well, of course." He trusted him, but in the end, he found himself in the most dangerous places. If it weren't for spatial magic, that's it, he would be finished. Emilio said that he himself agreed, without even listening to the end. Now he's become smarter, taught by experience. He's earned a lot, so let him rejoice. He replied that he should listen. If it weren't for him, he would have already been dragged 100%. Emilio concluded, okay, enough jokes, this time the request is not so wild. The protagonist thought, aha, so he already understands everything, that before he asked for complete madness. Maybe they should reconsider their friendship. Then asked, so what does he need now? Emilio raised his hand to his chest and said, he wants him to take him to the village of Howin. The protagonist asked again, to Howin? He answered, yeah, vegetables from there are just in great demand now. There are no supplies, we can't process orders. For the trading company, it is a potentially key partner. So it is necessary to personally meet with the farmers and greet them properly. And in general, he wants to settle all the details so that they have no reason to worry. The protagonist answered that he understands. In principle, it makes sense. In this world, of course, there is no internet or other amenities. Doing business remotely is a luxury, so personal contact is simply necessary. Everything here is built on personal connections, and he has the magic of movement. If they can shorten the distance, it would be stupid not to meet face to face. And the farmers themselves probably want to know who is selling their crops. The protagonist apologized. He was the one who started it all. He should have suggested it himself. Emilio looked at him and said, Correcto, he's so correct, honestly, so he shouldn't bother so much. The harvest from Howin is a full-fledged product. It brings in profit. So it's logical that he wants to take care of it himself. He thanked him and said, then he'll take him to Howin. Emilio said, yeah, and asked him. At that moment it dawned on him, and he asked, maybe they'll load the cart with goods? The protagonist answered menacingly, refused. If we do that, it will already be a purely business trip. They're just gonna get acquainted, right? Well, that's also true, right? The main character thought he understands that getting to know each other is important, and Emilio is right. But still, he begins to doubt whether it is worth introducing everyone to him at all. After all, their village is simple, and he's specific. Something is special about him today. The protagonist pointed his finger forward and said that they could do the trade another time. Anyway, he could jump there and back at any moment. The main thing now was to establish contact, and then trust would appear. The people in the village were kind. They would be understanding even without haste. Emilio looked at him and said that he agreed, then took his jacket off the hanger and added that they should at least take a light present with them. Although everyone has their own tastes, of course. So, Correcto, will he go shopping with him? He answered, okay, let's go. After a while, they found themselves at the market, walking between the stalls, examining and discussing the goods. At this time, Emilio bought ice cream, handed it to the protagonist, and said, here, this is for his company in shopping. He will eat. They are moving out. The protagonist looked at him in surprise and said, it's strange. He usually rushes everyone all the time. Later, they came to the fountain. Emilio sat down, ate ice cream, and continued. They were going there for the whole day. It would be nice to have a little rest before that. And knowing him, he was unlikely to let him breathe out on the spot, so while there was a chance, he would be alone with him. The protagonist asked, is he serious? Let him confess. It is not him he wants to keep, but his magic. Emilio shouted, but that goes without saying. But he is also dear to him as a friend. He looked at him and thought, he seemed cheerful, but he had never seen Emilio actually take a break. Even he does not work that hard. He works for two. He is probably tired after all. Meetings with the villagers are of course important, but he hopes that a little nature and fresh air will help him relax. After some time, they moved and found themselves near the village. The protagonist said, they are there. Emilio thanked him, looked at the fortress near the village, and said, wow, so this is what it is, the village of Howin. There was a guard near the gate. He called him and asked if he had a guest. The protagonist turned to him, greeted him, and introduced him. He was a merchant who sells vegetables from their village in the capital. He was surprised and exclaimed, wow, from the capital? Emilio looked at him and said, it was nice to meet him. He is Emilio, the head of the trading company, in charge of their products. He was even more surprised and said, such an important person came to them personally. The protagonist looked at Emilio and thought, well, he's famous. The guard asked, is this his magic, Correcto? MC agreed. He added that he was jealous. Maybe he will be lucky enough to get to the capital one day. In both directions, and that's it. Gold coins fly out like birds. Damn, expensive. Well, that's it. I'll stay in the village for the rest of my life. They walked into the village. The guard shouted after them. Andre seemed to be in the field. The protagonist turned around, thanked him, and said that they would definitely stop by later. Emilio stopped and noticed that he seemed to have a good relationship with the people of Howin. He turned around, agreed, and added that everyone here was great. He agreed with him, then folded his arms in front of his chest and added that he had just arrived. No one even batted an eyelid. MC said that even those who were now watching from afar did not feel any hostility from them. He emphasized that this village was special. Usually, in remote villages, strangers are strongly disliked. They had already gotten into serious trouble once. The protagonist noticed it was not funny at all. Then he raised his hand and thought that even in their world in the hinterland, strangers are often avoided. After all, he sent Emilio to different places with the help of magic, and that's how he saw how differently strangers are treated. Perhaps that is why this village was so etched in his memory. He said, "Well, welcome to Howin village anyway." They walked through the field and looked around. Emilio walked with his arms folded, and the protagonist said, "The nature is gorgeous, there is plenty of food, and the atmosphere in the village is open, warm." MC added, "And the people are calm, good-natured." Emilio replied, "Indeed, a great place. He is not surprised that he wanted to live here, Coretto." He looked at him and said, "Well." Then he thought, "Honestly, it is nice to hear praise from a businesslike guy like him." Emilio continued, "Well, then they will go straight to meet the farmers." He agreed and said, "Sure." First, he will take him to Andre. He asked, "Is he the one who grows green onions, right? He often visits him after all." He happily shouted, "That is him." They headed to the field. There they saw the girls. Emilio smiled and said, "Good afternoon." The girls became embarrassed and ran away. He waved at them, laughed and said how shy they were. Coretto yelled at him not to act like he did at Andre's house. He replied that he just smiled so he wouldn't exaggerate. The protagonist said that this was the home of a super adequate husband and loving father. If he even hints at flirting, that's it. Goodbye to the leeks, and without his leeks, they'll have a hard time. He replied that he understood. It would really be a problem. Then the protagonist turned away from him, folded his arms and said, "He knows people like him. He looks so urban, fashionable. He can knock girls out right away." Emilio smiled, patted the protagonist on the back and yelled at him not to worry so much. "He's not going to hit on those deer to Coretto." He looked at him in surprise and asked, "What?" Then he added, "Well, actually yes. The best really are for him to act like that." In the meantime, they approached Andre's house. The protagonist shouted, "Hi, Nina." She looked at him in surprise and shouted, "Coretto. And who is this?" Emilio leaned towards her and said, "That's why Coretto isn't interested in girls." The protagonist shouted, "He clearly misunderstood something. That's not true." Then he leaned towards her, apologized, said, "He's on business," and asked if she could go get mom and dad. She ran, waved her hand at them, and told them to wait a bit. Emilio turned to him and said, "He really just isn't interested in girls at all." He snapped, so he wouldn't even think of babbling about it in front of Andre. Got it? After a while, Stella and Andre arrived. He asked, "Is a merchant from the capital visiting us?" Emilio raised his hand to his chest, agreed, and introduced himself. "Nice to meet you. He's the manager of Emilio's trading company. His name is Emilio." He thought it necessary to greet them personally, since he was in charge of selling their products. Andre looked at him in surprise and said, "Emilio's trading company, even in such a remote place?" He asked, "Really?" Then leaned over and added, it was a great honor for him that the name of his company had reached even such remote places. Andre laughed and said, "So they trade in a cool market. And he is so young and already manages an entire company. Impressive. Not everyone can do that." Then he thanked him for coming all this way. And he noticed, although with Coretto's magic, they probably moved with one click, right? Emilio answered, "Well, that's exactly it." Stella added, "But it's still very nice that the head of the company himself came to them." Emilio turned and said, "Nice people." The protagonist looked at him and added, "That's exactly it." Then Andre thanked Coretto. They themselves wanted to know who exactly sells their vegetables. The protagonist shouted, "He has nothing to do with it." Here Andre introduced himself. He was Andre. Then he pointed to the woman and added, "And this is his wife, Stella. They mainly supply green onions and kagaimo, a fancy vegetable. And over there, their daughter, Nina." Emilio replied that he had heard about them from Coretto. Growing such large, high-quality onions, that was impressive. He was surprised. He didn't think that in other places it was considered a rarity. And they just treated it that way. Then he asked, in general, he would be interested to know how they grow it. Could he take a look? Since he had come, he definitely had to take a look. Then Emilio apologized for distracting them from their work. Andre replied, "No," so he wouldn't worry. Then he turned to Emilio and asked, since he had stopped by their garden, would he also like to look at the other farmers? He said, "If it's not too much trouble, I'd be happy to." Andre shouted, "No big deal," and they walked forward. The protagonist stayed behind and thought, a real merchant? Instantly joined the conversation. Communicates easily, quickly joined. But he is silent. I should learn from him. It seems that he worried in vain. A little while later they came to Elga. He invited them to the greenhouse to show the tomatoes. Later they drank in the house. Emilio drank a mug and shouted, "Delicious, another cup." The villagers looked at him, and one exclaimed, "Wow, wow." Another shouted, "And he, brother, seems thin, but he knows how to drink." Emilio looked at them and said that they should not underestimate him. By the way, he travels all over the world, negotiates and drinks along the way. Andre smiled and shouted, "Wow, a good guy," and added that he should drink. The protagonist watched what was happening and thought he just became one of them. Of course, the interaction of farmers and merchants is important, but drinking in the middle of the day? Andre, even the patient Stella, can lose patience. They were sitting at the table, then Elga appeared as a waiter and shouted, "Their order is tomato dishes." He looked at the table and shouted, "Wow, everything here is made of tomatoes." Elga replied, "Well, naturally, since they are selling their vegetables, they need to show how delicious they are properly." The residents who were watching this thought, "But it is true." One shouted, "Then he will treat him to dishes from his onion." Another added, "And he will show how to cook blue eggplants correctly." The third said, "And he will bring smoked tricolor soy." The main character smiled and thought, it seems that everyone was carried away. Well, since that's how it is, he will join the feast. Emilio said that he ate tomatoes, but like this, baked, for the first time. Elga looked at him in surprise and asked, "Has he never tried?" To be honest, when baked, the taste is revealed even more strongly, and with cheese, it's a win-win combo. Emilio replied that he understood and would try. The main character joined the meal and tried it and shouted, "Insanely delicious." Emilio took a fork, brought it to his mouth and said, "And indeed the sweetness is emphasized, and the cheese adds a chic touch." He winked and shouted, "I told you so." "Well, if you're too lazy to cook, you can bake it whole, and it will be delicious and healthy, by the way." At this point, the protagonist fell to his knees and shouted, "Starting tomorrow he will eat it every day, and for him to sell the box." Elga replied, "They all fell for it too easily." Emilio turned around and said, "Well, a man who has been around tomatoes all his life obviously knows how to cook them deliciously." He replied, "Of course," he thought, smiling from ear to ear. MC looked closely and said, "By the way, how do they plan to sell this? Under what name?" Elga turned to him and asked, "The name?" At this point, Emilio raised his hand to his chest and shouted, "Actually, this is why he came to talk. Selling Howin products without a name is too wasteful." The protagonist thought, well, overall, it makes sense, so that's the important topic. To create a brand, to stand out, you definitely need a name. Elga put his hand to his chin and said, "The name, they hadn't thought of that at all." He said he understood they would try to come up with something. Emilio disagreed and added, he wanted to announce it as soon as possible. They needed to announce it now. Elga shouted, "Right now." He was okay with that, but these guys were already tipsy and having a great time. The drunks from the village went to buy vegetables with a cheerful look. Emilio said, "Often when you drink, decisions are made faster." He replied, "This merchant is talking complete nonsense." The protagonist clarified, "He always talks such nonsense." Elga folded his arms across his chest, looked at Emilio and said, "But still, you can't just make up a name like that." Emilio raised his hand, pointed his finger forward, turned to Elga, and said, "Well, for example, they often use the name of a place or a farmer's surname." The protagonist said, "Wow, in this regard, this is not much different from his past world." Then he put his hand to his chin, thought for a moment and asked, "So, the Howin tomato? Or the Elga tomato?" He screamed in response, "No way in hell. The Howin tomato was okay, but what kind of Elga tomato is this?" Putting your name out there was awkward. The protagonist wondered, why? He thought it was cute, the Elga tomato. He grabbed him by the collar and screamed, easy for him to say, "He's not him." Then Emilio said thoughtfully, "Of course, it could be the Howin tomato, but the Howin name is already very common, and in the future, when they sell other products in the capital, it will be used as a generic name. So for the brand of his tomatoes, this is a missed opportunity." He turned around and asked, "What?" Then he grabbed his head with his hand and thought, "Damn, let them wait a little. He'll think of something now." Because of him, now he can't get the Elga tomato out of his head. Protagonist told him to accept it. He actually liked the way it sounded. Later, Andre said, "Well, it seemed to have been decided. Onion Hourin, eggplant Hourin, tomato Elga, tricolor domum, big watermelon." After some time, when everyone left, the protagonist wiped the table and said he was so full that he would not have dinner today. Then he thought, Elga, when they were choosing a name, was red as a tomato. He looked around and did not see Emilio anywhere. Then looked out the window, saw that he was standing on the balcony and looking into the distance. He called him and asked if he wanted some wormwood tea. Emilio turned to him, answered, "Yeah," and asked to pour. The protagonist was making tea, went out to Emilio on the balcony, put the mugs down, and he said, "He worked hard today." The protagonist replied, "Yeah, he just ate well, except for the teleport, he was probably tired." Emilio disagreed and added it was pretty funny. Here in the village, it is calm and pleasant, unlike in the capital. No need to brag, no need to overtake anyone. You can live at your own pace. MC was happy, patted him on the back. "That's it. Just like he thinks." Then he looked at him and asked, "Maybe he should stay and live here?" He answered that he would not stay. The protagonist concluded, "Well, yes, that's his style." A little earlier, Emilio and Rodney were walking down the street of the royal capital when suddenly a strange man threw a stone at them and shouted, "Damn, Emilio's company. Because of them, no one buys their vegetables now." Rodney looked at Emilio and said, "This is pure envy," asked him to ignore it. The man continued shouting that he spread his tentacles everywhere. He shouted, "This is how feuds are born." Emilio looked at the protagonist and thought, when you become famous, it's a common thing. If you take it to heart every time, you won't survive in the capital. But Kureto, he turned and asked, "What's wrong?" Emilio continued to think, he's too kind, he'll probably worry. So let him not know. Moreover, he turned to him and said, after spending time with the farmers of this village, he was convinced of this once again. His trading company can become even bigger. On the contrary, he only wanted to work more. He's not going to limit himself to the name of the best in the capital. He looked at him and thought, as always, full of hunger for life. Honestly, it's worth learning from him. Yes, he's the same Emilio who plows in the capital. He continued, but when he gets tired or something goes wrong, he'll probably drop by here, have some fun. The protagonist replied, then let him definitely tell, he'll move him here, but he'll charge him in full for it. At this time, Emilio grabbed his hand and asked, Kureto, what's wrong? Can't we do it for free in a friendly manner? He looked at him incredulously and asked, for free for him? This would definitely end badly. Even among friends, there should be politeness, and he himself would have done the same. At this time, Emilio raised his hands up and said, well, okay, perhaps it's time to return to the capital. MC asked in surprise, but he won't stay overnight? Emilio smiled and asked, what is he talking about? With his magic, he'll be back in a second, and besides, he has a lot of things to do, he wants to finish them quickly. The protagonist concluded, as always, a hard worker, and added, got it, boss. Sometime later, the protagonist was sitting in his garden, clearing the beds of weeds and thinking that he could remove large weeds with magic, but with small ones, it wouldn't work. Suddenly, he heard a familiar voice say to him, good morning, Kureto. He turned around, saw Nina, and wished her good morning in return. She asked if he was weeding the garden beds. He said, yeah, and thought, it was a hassle to deal with them, of course, but there was a charm to it, oh well. She came closer to him, showed him her strength on her arm, and shouted, well, let's go, she'll help. He was surprised. Seriously? She said, yeah, maybe you wouldn't say it, but she's very quick with the weeds, and got to work. He watched her and thought, really? Lightning fast. And she pulls them out right by the roots. There she is, a farmer's daughter. No, he can't leave everything to Nina. Okay, he should push a little harder. A little later they finished, raised their hands in the air and shouted happily, hooray! He added, they finished earlier than planned. Then he looked at her and thought, so cheerful, despite the fact that she was bending over all the time. That's youth. She sat down and looked at the bed and said, no sprouts. He thought, his lower back aches. He is not young anymore. The heat in the morning is unbearable, although still not as bad as in the capital, and in such heat, she did not even complain once, she just helped. He thanked her and said that she helped him out a lot. She smiled and shouted, you're welcome. He thought, what a wonderful child, just an angel. Then he asked, maybe they should drink some water. Does she want to? She said she did. Then he suggested that she come into the house, it's hot here. She agreed, then added that he should wait a minute. Then it dawned on him and he asked if she was by any chance busy with something. Nina said that she was going to get some firewood. He thanked her for helping despite this. Then he added then, as a token of gratitude, he would help her too. She exclaimed, really? And thanked him. He smiled and thought, he had a magic stove. But for a campfire in the countryside, firewood is just right. He would collect some for himself at the same time. Then they went into the house. He poured a drink and added ice to it. She took a sip and screamed. That perked her up. He drank a little and replied that he was glad to hear it. Then she added, I wish she had ice at home, like him. He noticed that a refrigerator is simply irreplaceable in the summer. Nina drank and said contentedly, cool, great. The protagonist said yeah and thought a real childish reaction. Then he continued, well, since we've wet our throats, it's time to go. She lay down on the table and said, it's time. If they're too late, Mom will worry. He looked at her and thought, well done. She doesn't give in even in the heat. Then he answered, exactly. Then he shouted, Nina. And he put a cold towel on her neck. She screamed, removed the towel and screamed, it's cold. He explained that he wet the towel and cooled it so that she could wrap it around her neck. It would make it easier. The girl agreed. Then he added, just in case, let her put some ice in her mouth for complete coolness. She replied that he was smart and thanked him. Later they were in the forest, looked around, and he said that there was almost no firewood left. She asked, perhaps someone had already come for them? He thought about it. After all, this was the entrance to the forest closest to the village, so maybe everyone came here first. The protagonist said, okay, and suggested that they teleport a little further into the forest. She happily screamed, this is magic. At that moment, they found themselves in the depths of the forest, and he asked, what about this area? She looked around and screamed in a satisfied voice, wow, how much firewood is here? The girl ran forward. He stopped and thought, the stream where he and Andre went, in the end, came in handy. It's cool here. After MC thought, and yet not a drop of fear of teleportation. As always, Nina's courage and curiosity are always amazing. Then he said, she can collect as much as she wants. He transfers everything with the help of magic. She stood next to him with a full basket of firewood, thanked him and added, here, let him keep this. At this time, the protagonist opened the storage and said, okay, let her just put it here. Nina went forward and wanted to touch it. Then she was surprised and said, it felt strange, everything disappeared. He said, well, yeah, that's how it happens with magic. She shouldn't worry, he could get it back at any time. She walked up to him and shouted, convenient. The protagonist looked at her and thought, such a quick adaptation. Later, she sat down and started looking for something in the grass, then said, since they've already come, they should also look for edible mushrooms. He was surprised and asked, Nina-sensei, does she know much about mushrooms too? She replied, aha, easy. Then she was surprised, sensei. He asked if it wasn't too hard for her, maybe she could teach him? She smiled and replied, of course. Then she ran further into the forest and shouted for him to follow her. They often grow near those trees. The protagonist followed her and shouted at her to wait and not to go too far alone. Later, they collected a whole basket of mushrooms. The protagonist wiped his forehead with his hand and thought, it's not even noon yet, but they've already managed to do so much. She noticed they did a good job and thanked him for his help. He replied, you're welcome. They both help each other. Then he asked if she wanted to rest at his place for a while. She put her hand to her mouth, agreed, and shouted that she wanted ice. He replied, no problem. Later they returned, went into the house, he made tea, put it next to her, and apologized for making her wait. Nina drank it and asked, is that barley tea? The protagonist replied, it's iced tea. It's sold everywhere in the capital. It's a type of tea, black, only chilled. She noticed what a pleasant smell, not at all like wormwood tea. He agreed and added, the aroma is great. She drank some more and said, it's not sweet. The protagonist agreed and thought, such an honest, sincere reaction. She continued, but it was still nice to drink. The protagonist said loudly, yes, it's fine. It's usually like this, not sweet, but it goes well with sweets. Then he opened the box, she looked in and screamed, wow, cookies. He told her to help herself. The girl ate, drank and said loudly, delicious. He replied that he was glad she liked it. She held a glass of tea in her hands, turned, looked at him and added, it tastes much better with tea than just like that. He added, look, this is a slightly more adult way to enjoy tea. Suddenly, she lowered her head and said, Kureto, he's so cool. There's so much in the capital that she doesn't know. There's probably still a lot of interesting things there. He looked at her and thought, damn, I think he upset her. After all, she admired the capital from the very beginning. Maybe he told her too much about things she doesn't know. Her sincere reaction was so cute that he couldn't help but start bragging. Then he exhaled and suggested, well then, what if they go to the capital right now? Does she want to? She looked at him in surprise, and at that moment he thought, no, wait, what is he even talking about? Then her eyes lit up, she grabbed her cheeks with her hands and screamed, really? MC thought, well, of course. Then he folded his hands and said, okay, especially since he promised earlier. She screamed, unbelievable, she seemed to be in a dream. Suddenly he pointed at her and said loudly, but only if mom and dad allow it. Without their consent, no way. Nina screamed she understood. Then she ran to the exit and screamed, she will definitely get permission. He looked after her and thought, even when she's in a hurry, she still carried away the firewood. What a good girl. It's not hard for him to take her with him, but if it's still possible to come to an agreement with Stella, then Andre definitely won't agree to let his beloved daughter go to an unfamiliar place. Never. Well, if it doesn't work out, he'll have to put up with it. After some time, Nina ran to him and shouted, Kureto, everything is fine. He opened the door, saw Nina and Stella and asked, has she told Andre yet? Stella answered, she didn't. He said, well, of course, who would doubt it? Then Stella added, she just wants Nina to see as much as possible, and besides, she will have such a reliable adult like Kureto with her. She believes that childhood impressions are the most valuable thing there can be. Even parents have no right to take away such opportunities. Of course, if it doesn't cause him inconvenience. He answered, it won't. He is very touched by such trust. Then Stella stroked Nina's hair and said, she will talk herself and that's all, and asked him to take care of Nina. He looked at her and thought, she's lucky to have a mother. Then he replied, okay. He understood everything. He would make the best memories for her. He would take care of her daughter. She smiled and thanked him, at which point he added, one more thing. When they returned, he really wouldn't want to be scolded. The protagonist thought about it. To be honest, he was not afraid for Nin's safety, but for Andre's reaction. Stella replied that he shouldn't worry. She would explain everything to him herself. He smiled and said, well then, right away, but before he could finish, Nina interrupted him, told him to wait, and pointed to her hair and exclaimed, her hair was disheveled. She was all sweaty. I need to change my clothes and tidy myself up. Then she ran out of Kureto's house. Stella followed her, turned around and apologized, then added that he should wait a little. He raised his hand and said, let her take her time. Even though she is 10, she is still a girl. Then he closed the door. leaned his hand on it and thought he should probably change too. The protagonist put on a new shirt, straightened the collar, exhaled and said, "This is much cleaner and neater." Suddenly he heard a familiar voice. The girl shouted, "Kureto." Then she apologized for making him wait. The protagonist looked out of the room and asked, "Is she ready?" At that moment, he saw a very beautiful girl near the front door and froze in surprise. She raised her hand and asked, "How does she look to him? Doesn't she look too strange?" He was at a loss for words from surprise and said, how can I say it?" and thought it's impossible not to notice how much she took after Stella. As expected, the genes of a beauty. Nina asked again, "Kureto, does she still look strange?" The protagonist disagreed and shouted, "On the contrary, she is prettier than most girls in the capital." Nina smiled, hit him in the side with her hand and said, "Well, this is too much." He replied that he was serious. She was always cute, but in such an outfit she just blossomed. She looked at him, smiled and said, "This shirt suits him very well too." He pointed at her and continued, "If she wore such clothes more often, she would probably become very popular." She disagreed, thanked him, said that it was uncomfortable to move in it, not suitable for agricultural work. He noticed, this is the real Nina. Let such outfits be for special occasions, like the harvest festival. Then he thought, it sounds like an interesting event. It's a bit of a pity, because it suits her. But he knows that if she wore this every day, Andre would be beside himself. At that moment, Stella came into the house and apologized for making him wait. Then she added, she was so happy that she couldn't help but try too. Nina turned to her and said, "Mom?" The main character said, "Stella." The girl asked, "Mom, is everything okay with her hair?" She answered, "Everything is fine, just don't touch it too often, otherwise everything will fall apart." Then she asked, "Did she forget anything?" She checked everything. MC looked at them and thought, after all, Stella is in charge of Nina's style. Then Stella asked, "Aren't they chatting too long? The longer they stay here, the less time they have in the capital." Nina clenched her fists and screamed that she doesn't want to. Then she grabbed the protagonist's hand, dragged him to the exit and screamed, "There's not much time." He answered okay and asked her to at least give him his shoes to put on. Stella looked at him, bowed and asked him to look after her daughter today. The protagonist smiled and answered, "Of course, she can rely on him." They left the house, then Nina turned around and screamed, "Mom, she's going. She'll bring her a souvenir." Stella waved her hand and told her not to worry, just have a good time. But just don't leave Kureto, okay? Nina screamed, "Okay." A minute later they found themselves on the street in the royal capital. The protagonist shouted, "They're here." The girl looked around in surprise. He pointed and asked, "Even Nina, no matter how you look at it, but when it comes down to it, she still gets nervous, right? Nina, is she okay?" She ran, raised her hands to her face and screamed joyfully, "This is true, for real, the capital." MC scratched his eyes with his hand and thought there was absolutely nothing to worry about. Nina happily pointed at the houses and shouted for him to look. The houses are so tall, so many fashionable shops, and there are a lot of people here. He looked at her and thought, whatever she saw, everything causes delight, and yet she is not scared at all. On the contrary, she has more than enough curiosity. The architecture here is completely different. Probably now everything in Nina's eyes looks completely new and unusual, although perhaps too much enthusiasm. She ran from side to side, waving her arms. The protagonist asked her not to get lost, okay? He raised his hand to his face and thought, well, really, he himself at the beginning, when he first got here, everything here seemed so fresh, the excitement gave way to delight. Habituation is a great power. At that time, she looked up with delight and shouted, "What a tall building!" He raised his hand to his forehead, looked up and said, "Yeah, that's the clock tower. There are a lot of people in the capital busy with work. The exact time is transmitted to the bell tower with the help of magical energy, and the bell rings out there." She clarified, "With the help of magic? So the villagers always know the exact time." He smiled and answered, "Well, you could say that, but then they are always in a hurry somewhere." And he thought he liked the leisurely life in the village better. Then he suggested to her, they could also go inside, go up. What would she say? Nina turned around and said, "Well, that sounds cool, but..." At that moment she saw a butterfly, raised her hand to her face and screamed, "Wow, what a beautiful butterfly." The protagonist replied, "It's simple illusion magic." She asked, "Is that magic too?" Suddenly, they heard a voice shouting, "Children, for them to come and watch." They came closer and saw a magician who continued, "A magnificent magic show is about to begin." At that time, he took off his hat, raised it up, and a bouquet of flowers appeared from there. Then he threw the hat, and all the flowers flew towards the children. At that moment, Nina caught one flower and screamed, "How beautiful! The capital, it's really amazing. That's why there is so much magic in the city. It fills the heart with happiness." He said that she was right, and thought, since she liked it all so much, he should have brought her here earlier. He leaned towards her and said loudly, "But his teleportation is also magic, by the way." She clenched her fists and screamed, "Magic is impressive too. It was just so beautiful there." MC added that he was joking, but so that she would listen. They had been in this square for a long time. Maybe they were going somewhere? Is there a place she wants to go? She looked at him and suggested then, maybe, to the place where they sell food. He asked, food? Of course, you can, but why there? She raised her hand up and said, food is the most familiar and understandable. He answered, logically. Then he brought his hand to his nose and thought, maybe he really wants to see a lot of things. The capital is so big and everything here is completely different. But food, it is the simplest and closest, besides, everyone understands it. He said, okay, then he will take her to the market in the central district. She screamed, hooray! After some time, they walked down the street. She did not cease to be amazed. Wherever they went, there were houses and so many people. The protagonist remembered, by the way, today is a holiday. That's probably why there are even more people than usual. She shouted, is that so? He looked at her and thought, Nin's eyes are running wild. He needs to keep up with her and watch carefully. Otherwise, before he could finish speaking, she pointed her finger forward and shouted for him to look. Beastmen and lizardmen. He was surprised, looked at her and asked, did she know about them? She smiled and answered that she had read about them in books. He praised her and said, well done. She looked at them in surprise and shouted, but this was the first time she had seen them in real life. Beastmen are so fluffy, he added. There are some that look almost like people. That's it. Even among beastmen and lizardmen, everyone has a different appearance. There are some that look almost like people, like ears, and there are those that look like real dogs or lizards. They say it depends on the heredity and the strength of the parent's blood, and even their physical abilities are different. Those with stronger beast blood are more likely to become warriors or adventurers. Then he folded his arms and thought, only humans live in Howin village, so this is all new to her. She asked if they would meet any more people from other races. He answered that they would. They were just walking down the street next to the guild. All kinds of people are there. She exclaimed, really? He continued, but it is better not to walk along those alleys. It is not safe. At this time, they heard someone shout for him to look. It is a teleporter. They turned around and the protagonist asked, this? Gadolf and Erd? Nina asked. A teleporter? Erd asked. Does it turn out that he has a child? The protagonist did not agree and continued, he is just showing the city to the daughter of a friend. Gadolf said, well then I understand. Well, yes, it is unlikely that he could have such a cute child. Not at all similar. Erd warned that with such jokes, the next time he teleports, he should be prepared to end up anywhere. The protagonist shouted at him not to joke like that. It is not funny. Nina turned to him and asked, so these are his friends, correcto? He answered, friends, rather colleagues at work. Erd clarified, he works in a guild, sends and meets people. They often turn to him. She exclaimed, is that so? The protagonist turned his face to the side and thought, a little awkwardly. At this time, Gadolf sat down next to Nin and asked, well, girl, is this the first time she sees representatives of other races? She answered that it was the first time. He offered, if she wants, she can touch his fur. She clenched her fists and joyfully screamed, can I? He added, only the tail and stomach, so that she does not touch. She screamed that she understood, and thanked him. Then she grabbed him, hugged him by his shaggy hand, closed her eyes with pleasure and screamed, so soft. He smiled and thought, so cute. Gadolf told him to wait, and what is he proud of? Then he added that his tail was shaking. She asked, isn't this the place that is not allowed? The protagonist stretched out his hands and said, Gadolf, he can too. He got angry and screamed, he can't. He asked, but why, even a little? He answered him rudely so that he would not pretend to forget how he humiliated him then. The protagonist remembered and said he just turned him over on his back when he was drunk. He roared, this is what he calls humiliation. He did not like it at all. At this time, Erd suggested that she, if she wanted, could touch his scales. She agreed, came closer, touched them and said, wow, they are so smooth, tough and cool. Erd asked, really? And thanked her. The protagonist thought that children are usually afraid of Erd, and Nina treats everyone equally warmly and kindly. This is her main charm. Erd seems happy. Gadolf asked, by the way, teleporter, hasn't he been working in the guild lately? Helena and others asked. He answered, well, yes, he has been busy with the trading company's affairs lately, and asked him to tell them that he will stop by soon. He answered, well, when he is around, it is easier for them to work, so they will wait. Then he added, and she, the girl, should come too. Then they turned and walked on. Then Gadolf turned and added that she should just come and play. Next time he will introduce her to other representatives of different races. Nina waved her hand after them, thanked them and shouted, see you? Then she closed her eyes, clenched her fists and shouted. Corretto's work friends turned out to be so kind. He looked at her and replied, yeah, well, partly because it was her, Nina. She shouted enthusiastically, and he sells vegetables and teleports people back and forth. It turns out that Corretto has so many different jobs. He replied, well, yeah, if you think about it, that's how he knows so many people. She continued, right. She was so surprised that they turned out to be acquaintances of Kirito. But you know, it's cool that so many people rely on him. You noticed that she was right. When they can rely on him, it's nice. Nina noticed correctly. Now, of course, he earns more in the trading company. But when he first came to this world, many people helped him a lot. In his past life, he pushed everyone away and ended up alone. Money is not the most important thing in life. You need to value your connections with people. Then he smiled and asked, well, are they going to the market? She clapped her hands with joy and agreed. After some time, they approached the market. There were a lot of goods and a lot of people. She screamed, so many stalls? Then she asked, are they all food stalls? The protagonist agreed and added, that's right. Products from all over the world flocked to the capital. She screamed enthusiastically. After all, the capital is something. She had never seen so many different products. And in the city they sell food like this, right on the streets. He raised his hand to his chin and thought, in the village of Howin, in such a remote place, goods are not brought in so often. Usually there is either an exchange or a trip to the neighboring village, or once in a while, traveling merchants come. Well yes, there is such an abundance here that your eyes run wide. At that moment she ran up to one of the stalls and shouted for him to look. There is a fish with such a funny face. Funny, he thought. Oh come on, that can't be. Then he went up to it, looked and said, it's a sea fish, called suobo. She screamed, the sea. She heard. Then she asked, it's wider than the river, and the water in it is salty, right? He praised her, said she really knows a lot. At that moment she looked at the price and screamed, what? Expensive. This fish costs 8 silver coins? He explained that magicians freeze it with ice magic or with the help of magic devices to transfer it, so both the work and the cost of magic. Nina was upset and said that it was a cruel reality. The protagonist added that the capital was expensive, of course, but if you go to a port city, the prices there are much lower. True, you will have to spend money on travel and time, but there is taste and freshness there. Therefore, sometimes it is cheaper and tastier to go there and eat local delicacies right there. The girl answered, I see. Then she realized, so he himself uses magic to preserve food and sell it in the capital for a higher price? He smiled and exclaimed, wow, she guessed. Well done. Buy cheap, sell expensive, the basis of trade. Nina laughed and said, now she at least a little bit understood what Kirito does. He thought, her head also works well. Afterwards he said thoughtfully, surprisingly, he already thought she was a smart girl. But maybe life in the capital would really suit her in the future. She turned to him and asked in surprise, really? He thinks that when she grows up, she will be able to live in the capital too? The protagonist smiled and thought, much more interest than he expected, then asked, Nina, would she ever want to leave the village? The girl stood next to him, sighed and quietly said, she doesn't know, but she always thought that she would just stay and cook vegetables, and now she imagined that there could be another life. He remembered the words of the village elder. Young people from the village often dream of the capital and leave. The protagonist thought, yeah, that's it. It wasn't only Greg and Taylor who left the village. Nina won't always be a child either. Maybe the day will come for her when she wants to try her luck in the capital. She has her whole life ahead of her. It's a little sad to think about it. When the time comes, he will need to support her and help her with advice, although he wants this to happen as late as possible. She called him, pointed to another counter and shouted, they also sell vegetables here, so that they should come and look. He smiled and said, after all, she is a child. She ran to the counter, shouting vegetables. She ran up, looked at the counter and asked in surprise, is this by any chance an onion? The seller agreed. Then she lowered her hands and concluded, it is somehow small. These words made the protagonist feel uneasy, and the seller shouted, hey girl, what's wrong with you? They buy only the freshest onions from the best farmers. He took out an onion, began to show it to her, and was indignant, so that she could see how dense and shiny it was. The protagonist leaned towards the girl, took her by the shoulders, apologized and added, she just expressed herself incorrectly. He will talk to her. The seller calmed down a bit and replied, okay, let's move on. She got carried away. She's a child after all. MC apologized again and said that they were leaving. They walked on, then she sat down on a bench and asked him to say, did she really say something strange? He disagreed and added, she said everything correctly. The girl continued, but he apologized for her. Then he told her to listen. She did not say anything strange, and the seller was not wrong. Then explained, onions from Hourin village, as far as he knows, are the tastiest and largest. That's a fact. But such onions do not grow everywhere. That seller simply does not know about onions from Hourin. To her, they seemed small, but for everyone else, this is a normal size. Just different ideas about the norm. She will find out in time. Don't worry. She thought about it and answered, I understand, but it turns out she offended him. She herself would be upset if someone said that their onions are small. He smiled and asked, then they will go look at other vegetables? That's the beauty of the capital. There is a lot of everything. A great reason to learn something new. She looked up, agreed, and shouted that she wanted to look. Then she thanked him and added that thanks to him, She learns so many new things, and it is so interesting. The protagonist looked at her and thought, thinking and reflecting is, of course, important. But since they are in the capital, they should just enjoy it and not just think. The protagonist pointed to the side and suggested that they also go to that market. It is quite big. She raised her hands up and shouted joyfully, "Wow! This will be great." Sometime later, they were walking down the street and eating ice cream. Suddenly, Nina stopped, laughed, and noticed that her stomach was growling. The protagonist turned to her, smiled, and asked, "One ice cream was not enough, right? Well, they walked a lot for her to want to eat, right?" Nina hesitated, then became shy and quietly said that she wanted to go to some stylish cafe, one that she usually couldn't go to. The protagonist was eating ice cream, looked at her and thought, the purring doesn't bother her, but this made her shy, right? After all, Nina finally asked for something that was really in the spirit of a big city. Come to think of it, there are no cafes or restaurants in Howin village. It's normal for a girl her age to dream of having lunch in a nice cafe. Maybe he should try harder here. He put his hands on his hips and said, "Okay." And she was happy and said, "Right away? Then let's go right away." He raised his hand up and said that they would go to a trendy place. She clenched her fists and asked, "Where?" He raised his head up and thought, damn, he doesn't know a single trendy place. Come to think of it, even though he lives in the capital. Nina looked at him with her big eyes and asked, "Corretto?" He looked at her and thought, sometimes he drinks somewhere alone, but mostly he eats at home. He turns out to be quite lonely, and he has no idea about cafes where girls would like it. The protagonist grabbed his hair with his hands and thought, if only he had a phone now, but he doesn't have one. But asking for something he doesn't have is pointless. Maybe they'll just go somewhere random? But if she asks if he's been here, it will be awkward. Those places where the business lunches of the trade guild are held, with a dress code and complex rules. You need something with royal capital charm, stylish, but without unnecessary fuss, where you can sit quietly and have a delicious lunch, and the snack bars near the guild are not an option at all. The protagonist called her and said, of course this is not quite what she asked, but maybe they should go to his home instead, to his capital city home. She looked at him in surprise and shouted, "That's right." The protagonist raised his hands up and said, "There's very good cooking there, like in a restaurant. And the view from the window is also not bad. How about it?" She raised her hands up and shouted that she wanted to. On the contrary, it's even more interesting. She wants to look at his other house, Corretto. MC closed his eyes, crossed his arms and said, "Great, he's glad she likes it." Then he smiled and added, "Okay, then it's decided." He took her hands and asked if he could ask her to wait a little bit upstairs. At that very moment, they found themselves on the balcony of a high-rise building. Nina looked down and shouted, "Wow, what a view." The protagonist explained he would come back with magic now and ask for it to be cooked. He would come back quickly. Would she wait? She watched from the balcony with great interest and without turning around shouted, "Okay." He thought she seemed kind of absent-minded and replied, he hopes everything is okay. Of course, it would be safer to go together, but I want her to walk there, not teleport, and Elsa and the girls should still be at home. He pushed off and thought, there are not many people here. He thinks everything will be fine. He just needs to fly quickly and come back right away before Nina gets bored. After some time, they were standing at the gates of his capital city house. She raised her hands to her face and asked excitedly, "Is this a palace?" He smiled and answered, "It is not that big, it is just his house, so there is no need to worry." They looked in and he said that he is back. At the entrance, they were met by maids and Elsa said, "Welcome home, Mr. Corretto."